Before the chronicles of Rome, before the rise of mighty empires and the shaping of modern civilization, there was a tale that echoed through the ancient world like thunder over the sea, the Iliad. This was not merely a story of swords and spears, but of pride that could topple kings, wrath that could burn cities, and gods whose unseen hands steered the fate of mortals. Our journey begins on the shores of Troy, where the Aegean winds carried the scent of war. Across the waters the great Greek coalition had gathered, 1,000 ships strong, each one carrying warriors bound by oath and vengeance. On the other side, the proud walls of Troy stood defiant, their golden towers watching, waiting. But the war was not truly born of politics or power. It began with a single insult, a wound to the pride of a man who would rather see his world burn than bow to another's will. And from that spark came a fire that neither man nor God could contain. Subscribe line. If you want to step into the pages of history and feel the battles, betrayals, and blood of the past come alive, make sure to subscribe now, so you never miss the next journey through the ancient world. The sun rose over the plains of Troy, spilling gold across the Aegean Sea. The Greek camp stretched from the shoreline inward, a sea of tents, weapons, and weary soldiers who had fought for 9 long years. Smoke from cooking fires mingled with the scent of salt and the distant cries of gulls. But beneath the routine of the morning, tension simmered, an invisible current running between the leaders of the Greek army. At the heart of that tension stood Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and commander of the Greek forces. He was a man accustomed to authority, accustomed to obedience. When he spoke, armies marched. When he frowned, lesser kings bowed their heads. Yet even Agamemnon knew that among his warriors, there was one whose name inspired more fear and respect than his own. Achilles, son of Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis, the swiftest and deadliest fighter alive. The quarrel began over a prize of war. After a recent raid on a Trojan allied town, the spoils were divided among the Greek leaders. Achilles received the maiden Briseis, a token of honor that reflected his status. Agamemnon received Chryseis, daughter of a Trojan priest of Apollo. But when Chryseis came to ransom his daughter, offering gold and pleading for her release, Agamemnon refused, rudely and publicly. It was a mistake. Chryseis left in humiliation and prayed to Apollo for vengeance. The god heard him. Soon after, a plague struck the Greek camp, felling soldiers by the dozens each day. The air filled with the stench of sickness. Funeral pyres burned constantly. In council, the prophet Calchas revealed the cause, the anger of Apollo and the price of appeasement, the return of Chryseis without ransom and an offering to the god. Agamemnon's pride boiled. To return his prize was one thing. To be ordered to do so in front of the other kings was another. In a fit of rage he agreed, but not without threatening to take another prize to make up for his loss. His eyes fell on Achilles. The insult was swift and devastating. Agamemnon sent men to seize Briseis from Achilles' tent. The younger man stood silent as she was led away, but inside him wrath roared like a storm. His honor, publicly stripped. His authority, trampled by a man he considered unworthy. In that moment, Achilles made a choice that would shape the fate of the war. He would fight no more. He withdrew to his tent, refusing to join the battles ahead. But his anger did not end there. Lifting his hands to the sky, he called upon his mother, Thetis, and asked her to go to Zeus, king of the gods. Let the Trojans push the Greeks to the brink, Achilles prayed, so that Agamemnon would see how much he had lost. Far above, in the halls of Olympus, the gods watched with interest. Hera and Athena favored the Greeks, while Aphrodite and Apollo sided with the Trojans. But Zeus, cautious, calculating, listened to Thetis' plea and gave a nod. The fate of thousands would now bend under the weight of one man's wounded pride. On the battlefield, the absence of Achilles was immediately felt. The Trojans, led by their prince Hector, pressed the attack. Their chariots rolled like thunder over the plain, their spears flashing in the sun. Greek warriors fought fiercely, but without their greatest champion, the balance began to shift. In the camp, Agamemnon wrestled with the consequences of his decision. He was a man who had led vast armies, conquered lands, and defied kings, but this was different. This was a war where the gods themselves intervened, where every decision echoed beyond mortal understanding. His pride had driven away the warrior who could have ended the siege, and now, for the first time in years, the Greeks found themselves fighting for survival. Meanwhile, in Troy, the mood was cautiously hopeful. Hector knew the war was far from over, but the absence of Achilles gave his soldiers new courage. They believed the tide could turn. The walls of Troy had held for 9 years, perhaps they would hold forever. Yet the will of the gods was rarely so simple. Already schemes were in motion, plans that would draw other heroes into the fire, test loyalties, and pit friend against friend. And in his tent, Achilles' rage only deepened, a smoldering ember waiting for the moment to ignite into an inferno. The spark had been lit. Pride and wrath had set the wheels of fate in motion, and neither kings nor gods would escape what came next. The uneasy silence over the Trojan plain felt heavier than the humid air that clung to the warrior's skin. Dawn's light had barely crept over the horizon, painting the sea in muted gold, yet the tension between the Greeks and Trojans was already palpable. What had begun as a momentary pause in battle, a fragile truce, was now splintering under the weight of mistrust, pride, and festering rage. For a short while the two armies had stood apart, their shields at their sides, their spears lowered. Priam, the aged king of Troy, had agreed to allow a brief armistice so the dead from both sides could be retrieved and honored. Bodies were carried away from the dust and gore of the battlefield, armor stripped and blood washed from their faces, their features still twisted in the final moments of pain. This ritual, meant to humanize the slaughter, only deepened the bitterness. Every corpse returned to the Greeks was a reminder of the Trojan arrows that had found their mark. Every Trojan body was a silent accusation against the bronze blades of Mycenae. Among the Greeks, murmurs passed between captains. "A truce with liars," muttered Menelaus, his voice low but dripping with contempt. He had not forgotten, could not forget, that Paris, son of Priam, had stolen Helen from his home. The insult had cut deeper than any sword, and the fact that Paris still walked the walls of Troy while thousands lay dead only made Menelaus' blood boil. Odysseus, more cautious, urged restraint. "There will be time to fight," he told the gathered leaders. "Let us not break the gods' will by striking before the appointed hour." Yet even as he spoke, his eyes flicked toward the Trojan lines, scanning for signs of treachery. The Trojans were no less restless. Hector, prince of Troy, paced along the ranks of his warriors. The truce gave him no comfort, it only delayed the inevitable storm. He knew the Greeks would never sail away without victory or revenge, and each passing day brought more omens that the gods themselves were sharpening their weapons. Already, Apollo had whispered through the priests that the city would bleed before the moon's next cycle. It was in this brittle atmosphere that the first spark fell. The breaking of the truce. Some said it was a misunderstanding. Others claimed it was divine will. But all agreed that the moment the arrow flew, there was no going back. A Trojan archer, Pandarus, stood near the forward lines. He had been itching for glory, his bow hand restless during the lull. Perhaps he acted on his own ambition, thinking to win Hector's favor by striking down a Greek leader before the truce expired. Or perhaps it was Athena, cloaked in disguise, who whispered in his ear and guided his aim. After all, the gods had never been shy about meddling in mortal affairs. His arrow, loosed with deadly precision, found Menelaus. The shaft struck not deep enough to kill, for his armor turned much of the blow, but the wound was enough to draw blood, and with it, the wrath of every Greek in earshot. Cries went up along the Achaean line. "Treachery!" shouted Ajax the Greater, raising his enormous shield. Warriors surged forward, rage overtaking discipline. The priests who had overseen the truce scattered, knowing their role was over. Trumpets blared, not for ceremony but for war. Menelaus, gritting his teeth against the pain, ripped the arrow free and held it high for all to see. "They strike under the banner of peace," he roared. "Let none spare the Trojans." His words, like oil on fire, sent the Greeks into a frenzy. The fury of the battlefield. The clash was immediate and brutal. Spears hurled across the short distance found their marks in the first rush. Shields slammed against shields, the sound echoing like drumbeats of doom. Bronze clanged, arrows hissed, and the earth shook under the charge of hundreds of men. Odysseus, though a voice for reason earlier, now fought with cold precision, his sword cutting through Trojan ranks as if slicing through fate itself. Ajax towered above the fray, his massive shield absorbing a hail of arrows as he drove forward like a living wall. On the Trojan side, Hector answered the treachery with disciplined fury, calling his men into tight formations to absorb the Greek onslaught. He fought like a man who understood both his duty and the inevitability of his fate, striking down enemies yet always keeping one eye on the flow of the battle. The air grew thick with dust kicked up by charging feet, mingling with the metallic tang of blood. Horses screamed as chariots crashed into one another, their drivers thrown to the ground to be trampled beneath the chaos. And above it all, unseen by mortal eyes, the gods watched. On Olympus, Zeus reclined, his expression unreadable, while Hera leaned forward with narrowed eyes. Athena stood ready to intervene, her spear in hand, while Apollo's golden bow shimmered in the light. Every god had a favorite in this war, and every act on the battlefield was like a move in their divine game. The turning point of the day. Though the Greeks pressed hard, the Trojans did not break. Twice, the Achaeans reached the enemy's front ranks and twice they were repelled. It was as if the city itself poured its strength into Hector's arms. But then came the moment that shifted the tide. Diomedes, son of Tydeus, charged forward with a ferocity that startled even his own men. Striking down one Trojan after another, he seemed unstoppable, until a sudden gleam of armor caught his attention. Pandarus, the archer who had broken the truce, stood before him. The two clashed, Pandarus' bow useless in close combat. Diomedes' spear pierced his foe, avenging Menelaus' wound and sending a ripple of fear through the Trojan lines. Emboldened, the Greeks surged forward once more, their battle cries drowning out the pounding of their own hearts. But just as victory seemed within reach, the gods intervened again. A blinding light swept across the field, Apollo's power, shielding the retreating Trojans and restoring their will to fight. The Greeks, though fierce, could not match divine force. The rage that could not be quenched. By day's end, the field was littered with the dead and dying, the truce long forgotten. Menelaus, his wound bound but his pride unhealed, swore to see Troy burn. Hector, grim and unbowed, swore to protect it to his last breath. The war, already years old, had found new fuel. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold, the leaders of both armies knew this was no longer a conflict of mere honor, it had become a fire that would consume them all. The battlefield after sunset was not silent. The cries of the wounded drifted across the plain, mingling with the moans of dying horses and the crackle of hastily lit funeral pyres. Torches bobbed along both the Greek and Trojan lines as men searched for the bodies of their friends, dragging them back to camp. The smell of blood and smoke lingered heavy in the air, and even the sea breeze could not wash it away. In both camps there was no illusion of peace. The day's fighting had proven that the war was now past the point of negotiation. What remained was endurance, and the will to outlast the enemy until one side lay in ruin. While mortal men tended to their dead, the gods convened in the high halls of Olympus. The great marble columns gleamed in the light of the setting sun, and the throne of Zeus dominated the assembly. Around him the other Olympians gathered, each with their own stake in the war. Hera's voice was the first to rise. She stood tall, her eyes sharp as polished bronze, and accused the Trojans of deceit. She reminded Zeus of Paris' insult years ago when he had awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite, rejecting her and Athena. That slight, she said, still demanded vengeance. Athena supported Hera's fury. The goddess of wisdom had little patience for Trojan arrogance and even less for the dishonor of broken truces. She demanded the right to aid the Greeks openly, to guide their spears and shields until Troy's walls crumbled. Across the hall, Apollo rose in defense of the Trojans. His golden hair caught the torchlight as he spoke with calm authority. The Greeks, he argued, had brought this war upon themselves by sailing across the sea to seize what was not theirs. Paris, he said, had not stolen Helen. She had chosen to leave with him under Aphrodite's blessing. To punish Troy for love was to spit on the power of the gods themselves. Aphrodite, seated beside him, nodded in agreement. She was less concerned with the politics of the war than with the fate of Paris and Helen, but her loyalty was unwavering. Zeus listened without speaking for a long time. His gaze swept over the assembly, weighing the pride of his wife against the petitions of his children. Finally he spoke in a voice that shook the air. He declared that the war must play out according to fate. The gods could act, but not in ways that would end the war too soon. Let the mortals fight, he said, and let the will of destiny decide the victor. But his decree did not mean the gods would remain idle. It meant only that their hands would be hidden until the moment of greatest need. On the plain below, as the gods reached their uneasy agreement, the two armies prepared for the next day. In the Greek camp, Agamemnon met with his captains. They sat around a long table lit by oil lamps, the map of Troy spread before them. The walls of the city were high, the gates thick, and the defenders determined. To take it by storm would be costly, perhaps impossible without weakening the defenders through constant battle. Agamemnon proposed a plan of relentless assaults, to grind the Trojans down day after day, forcing them to burn through their stores of food and morale. Menelaus, still nursing his wound, supported the idea with a grim smile. Odysseus, though he agreed, suggested keeping the option of trickery open. Walls can be climbed, he said, but hearts can be deceived. In Troy, Hector walked the ramparts with his younger brother Deiphobus. From up high, the fires of the Greek camp looked like a second starry sky spread across the plain. Hector knew that every one of those lights marked men who had crossed the sea to kill him and his people. He spoke quietly, his words for his brother alone. The Trojans could not meet the Greeks in open battle for too many days in a row. Too many sons of Troy had already fallen. Instead, they would need to strike hard and then retreat behind the safety of the walls. It was a strategy of survival, but Hector had no illusions that survival was victory. When dawn came, it came with the sound of horns. The Greeks advanced in tight formation, bronze shields gleaming in the first light. Spears bristled in the front ranks, and the dust of their march rose behind them. Across the plain, the Trojans poured out of the Scaean gate, Hector at their head in a chariot drawn by sleek, black horses. The space between the armies closed quickly. At the first clash, the gods moved again. Athena, unseen, guided the arm of Diomedes as he thrust his spear into the heart of a Trojan captain. Apollo, equally invisible, turned the shaft of a Greek spear aside, saving a young warrior who would later guard the city's gate. Hera swept a veil of fear over the Trojan left flank, causing them to falter, while Aphrodite shielded Paris from the javelin of Ajax. The battle became a tapestry of divine influence woven into mortal courage. Midway through the day, Diomedes found himself face to face with Aeneas, the Trojan prince favored by Aphrodite. Their duel was fierce, their blows ringing like hammer on anvil. Diomedes, driven by a strange fire, wounded Aeneas and would have finished him had Aphrodite not intervened. Wrapping her arms around her son, she tried to carry him away, but Diomedes, recognizing the goddess, struck at her hand and drew immortal blood. Aphrodite cried out and fled to Olympus, leaving Aeneas for Apollo to rescue. The god enveloped the Trojan prince in a mist and spirited him back to safety, healing his wounds. This act inflamed the war further. Athena descended to inspire Diomedes, telling him he now had leave to strike at any god who opposed him, save only for Zeus himself. With this blessing, Diomedes fought like a man possessed, cutting down enemies with almost supernatural speed. The Trojans, under pressure, began to give ground, their retreat slowed only by Hector's stubborn defense. But the gods' game was not finished. Apollo, seeking to balance the scales, breathed strength into the Trojan ranks. Hector, feeling the surge, rallied his men and led a counterattack that drove the Greeks back toward their ships. In the confusion, Paris loosed an arrow that struck Diomedes, wounding but not killing him. The Greek hero was pulled from the front lines and the momentum shifted again. As the sun dipped lower, the field was littered with bodies. The day had brought no decisive victor, but both sides had suffered heavy losses. In the Greek camp, Agamemnon praised the courage of his men but warned that the war would only grow harsher. In Troy, Priam welcomed his son Hector back with relief, but the old king's eyes were heavy with the knowledge that this was only the beginning of a greater storm. Far above, on Olympus, the gods looked down with satisfaction and anticipation. The war was now fully in motion, the lines drawn not just between Greeks and Trojans, but between the immortals themselves. And though Zeus had spoken of fate, each god knew they would shape that fate in their own image. The stage was set for the conflict to deepen. Pride had already burned away reason. Wrath had silenced the voices of peace. And now, with the gods themselves taking sides, the war would no longer belong to men alone. The uneasy truce that had briefly settled over the plain of Troy was a fragile thing from the beginning. It was born not of genuine reconciliation but of exhaustion, grief, and political necessity. For a few precious hours the battlefield lay quiet, and the bodies of the dead were gathered for burial. But beneath the stillness, hatred simmered. The warriors on both sides, Greek and Trojan alike, had lost brothers, cousins, and comrades. The air was heavy with the memory of insult and betrayal. And among the gods above, the quarrels that had fueled mortal strife were far from over. Olympus itself seemed restless. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and commander of the Greek host, paced before his tent, his mind working restlessly. His pride had already driven a wedge between himself and Achilles, the greatest warrior of their cause. That quarrel had cost the Greeks dearly in lives and morale. Now, even after the truce, Agamemnon's authority was challenged by murmurs in the ranks. Men whispered that his arrogance had angered the gods, that perhaps he was unfit to lead. He dismissed such talk publicly, but in the privacy of his thoughts, it ate at him. His position was one that could not tolerate weakness. The war must be resumed, and it must be resumed on his terms. Within Troy's high walls the mood was no less tense. Priam, the aged king, sat in council with his sons and chief advisors. The funeral rites had given the city a brief reprieve, but everyone in that chamber knew it would not last. Hector, Priam's eldest and most valiant son, had pressed for the truce so that both sides might tend to their dead without dishonor. But even he understood that the Greeks would soon test Troy's defenses again. And when they did, he would be the one to meet them. Beside him sat Paris, whose abduction of Helen had sparked the war in the first place. Paris remained proud, convinced that the gods, especially Aphrodite, would continue to protect him. Hector, though loyal to his brother, could not help but think how many lives had been lost for the sake of that single act of passion. The tension between the brothers was not lost on those present. Antenor, an elder statesman, cautiously raised the idea that perhaps Helen could be returned to the Greeks along with suitable compensation. His words were met with silence from Hector, scorn from Paris, and a dark look from Priam. Such talk, while logical, was politically dangerous. It suggested that Troy might be willing to yield after nearly 10 years of defiance. Paris broke the silence first, declaring that Helen was his by right and that no gold or treaty could buy her back. The council broke without agreement, and the city's fate remained tied to her beauty. Meanwhile, in the Greek camp, the gods themselves began to stir the pot once more. Hera and Athena, still burning with hatred for Troy because of Paris's judgment in the contest of beauty, whispered to their favored warriors. Messages came in dreams, visions of victory if only the Greeks would strike first, assurances that the gods were on their side. On the other hand, Apollo and Aphrodite moved among the Trojans, offering similar encouragement. The truce had been agreed upon by men, but the immortals had never signed it. And in this war the will of the gods was often the decisive factor. The spark that would end the truce came not in a great council or formal declaration, but in the chaos of the battlefield's edge. A Trojan archer named Pandarus, skilled and ambitious, saw his chance to earn glory. Whether moved by personal ambition or guided by Apollo's subtle prompting, he loosed an arrow across the no-man's land. The shaft flew true, striking Menelaus, the very man whose wife's abduction had ignited the war. Though the wound was not fatal, it was enough to shatter the fragile peace. The Greeks erupted in outrage, shouting curses at the treacherous Trojans. Agamemnon seized on the moment, calling the attack proof of Troy's deceit and ordering his men to arm at once. The battlefield, which only hours before had been a place of mourning, transformed again into an arena of death. Lines of bronze-clad warriors formed up, shields locking together, spears leveled. The air rang with the clash of armor and the rhythmic chant of commanders driving their men forward. Trumpets blared, and dust rose from the earth under the pounding of thousands of feet. Above, the gods took their places, watching like patrons at some grim sport. The first clashes were brutal. Greek chariots surged forward, their drivers steering with skill as warriors hurled spears into the Trojan lines. Hector responded swiftly, rallying his own chariot corps to meet them head-on. The two forces met with a crash that shook the ground. Spears splintered, shields dented, and men fell screaming into the dust. The cries of the wounded mingled with the shouts of those still fighting, creating a chorus of rage and agony. In the midst of this chaos, personal rivalries flared. Ajax the Greater, a towering figure among the Greeks, carved his way through the Trojan front ranks, scattering men before him. His shield, a massive wall of oxhide and bronze, turned aside spear after spear as he pressed forward. Hector met him in single combat, their blows ringing like hammer on anvil. For long moments, neither could gain the upper hand, and their struggle became a focal point for both armies. Yet before a decisive blow could be struck, the press of battle forced them apart, each dragged back by his comrades. Elsewhere, the cunning Odysseus used the confusion to lead a small band deep into the Trojan flank. Striking suddenly, they sowed panic among the enemy before withdrawing under cover of the main assault. His hit-and-run tactics bought the Greeks valuable breathing space and kept the Trojans from pushing too far. Pandarus, whose arrow had reignited the war, fought fiercely but soon found himself targeted. Menelaus, wounded but not incapacitated, sought him out on the field. The two clashed in a flurry of blows, but it was Diomedes, another Greek champion, who finally struck Pandarus down. Diomedes fought like a man possessed, cutting down Trojan after Trojan. At one point he even wounded Aeneas, the Trojan prince and son of Aphrodite. When the goddess herself descended to shield her son, Diomedes dared to wound her as well, forcing her to flee Olympus in humiliation. Such defiance of the divine was rare, and it sent shockwaves through the assembled gods. This escalation marked a turning point. The war was no longer simply a contest between Greeks and Trojans. It had become a direct struggle between the factions of Olympus. Hera and Athena exulted in Diomedes' boldness, while Apollo seethed at the insult to his ally. The gods began to intervene more openly, taking sides in skirmishes, deflecting blows, and even turning the tide of small engagements. Mortal courage and skill still mattered, but divine favor, or the lack of it, could mean the difference between life and death. By the day's end, the battlefield was strewn with the bodies of the fallen. The Greeks had pushed the Trojans back toward their walls, but they had not broken them. The cost had been high on both sides. Agamemnon, surveying the carnage, felt a grim satisfaction. The war was once more in full motion, and the memory of the truce was already fading. For him, the arrow of Pandarus had been a gift, a justification for renewed assault, a chance to reclaim his standing as the commander who would not be insulted without reprisal. Within Troy, the mood was grim but defiant. Hector walked the walls, speaking with the sentries, ensuring that every gate was guarded, every tower manned. He knew the Greeks would return with even greater force, and he was determined to meet them. In the palace, Priam comforted the families of the fallen, his own heart heavy with sorrow. Paris, for his part, remained largely untouched by the day's events, secure in his belief that the gods would protect him as they always had. But among the common people of Troy, doubts began to grow. How long could the city withstand such unrelenting pressure? How many more sons must be buried before the end came? These questions would linger in the shadows, waiting for their moment to emerge. For now, the war was once again the only reality, and the oaths sworn in peace had been shattered beyond repair. The morning sun rose over the Achaean camp, its pale light falling upon a scene of quiet tension. Though the day had barely begun, the air already carried the smell of burnt offerings to the gods. The Greeks were desperate for favor from Olympus, for the night had brought ill omens, shooting stars that blazed across the sky, the cries of night birds heard where they should not be, and dreams filled with the images of blood and ruin. Many warriors woke uneasy, speaking little as they prepared their arms. Rumors spread like wildfire. The Trojans were mustering again in greater force, and the fragile truce agreed upon the day before was already on the brink of collapse. On the plain between Troy's towering walls and the Achaean ships, heralds moved to and fro, delivering messages between the armies. Yet the voices of diplomacy were soon drowned by the clamor of armor and the sound of marching feet. The cause was simple. Paris, Prince of Troy, had returned to the front lines, no longer hiding behind the safety of his walls. His duel with Menelaus had been meant to end the conflict, but the gods had other designs. Aphrodite's intervention had snatched him from certain death, and now his very presence ignited rage among the Greeks. Many saw his reappearance not as a sign of courage but as an insult, proof that the Trojans had no intention of honoring their oaths. By mid-morning the truce was in tatters. An arrow, loosed by a Trojan archer, whether by accident or divine provocation, struck a Greek soldier in the throat. The man fell before his comrade's eyes, his blood soaking the dust. Cries of outrage erupted, and within moments both sides surged forward, the thin veil of peace torn apart. The battlefield roared to life once more. The Trojans, led by Hector, swept across the plain with a determination born of pride and desperation. Hector's chariot wheels carved deep grooves into the earth as he urged his horses onward, shouting commands to the warriors who followed in his wake. His bronze helmet caught the light like a blazing star, and the sight of him inspired his men to press harder. Behind him came Aeneas, his cousin and one of Troy's most steadfast defenders, along with Sarpedon, the Lycian prince whose skill with the spear was renowned far beyond the Aegean. Together they drove their wedge into the Achaean lines. The Greeks, however, were not caught unprepared. Ajax the Greater, towering above his peers, stood like a living fortress, his massive shield absorbing blow after blow. With every swing of his spear, another Trojan fell. Nearby, Odysseus moved through the chaos with calculated precision, his mind as sharp as his blade, directing his men to where they were most needed. Diomedes, too, fought with a fury that seemed almost inhuman, his recent victories lending him a confidence that bordered on recklessness. It was in the midst of this renewed chaos that the gods once again descended into mortal affairs. On the Trojan side, Apollo strode unseen through the ranks, his golden bow in hand. He guided arrows into their marks, bringing down Greek captains with deadly accuracy. At the same time, Athena moved among the Achaeans, whispering courage into weary hearts and turning aside the spears aimed at their leaders. Yet even their divine influences could not fully control the tide. The field was too vast, the fury too great. By midday the fighting had reached a fever pitch. The plain was a shifting sea of men and horses, shields clashing, spears shattering, and swords flashing in the sun. Dust rose in choking clouds, mixing with the smell of sweat and blood. Cries of pain and triumph echoed in equal measure, while the wounded crawled or were carried from the field, their armor dented and darkened with gore. Hector sought out the strongest among the Greeks, challenging them one by one, but his eyes were ever searching for Achilles. The great son of Peleus, however, remained absent from the fighting, still nursing his wrath in his tent. Hector knew that as long as Achilles stayed away, there was hope for Troy. But the other Achaean champions fought with such ferocity that hope was a fragile thing indeed. In one brutal exchange near the Scamander River, Sarpedon and Diomedes clashed in a storm of steel. The Lycian prince hurled his spear with deadly force, grazing Diomedes' shoulder, but the Greek answered with a thrust that split Sarpedon's shield in two. Only the timely intervention of Glaucus, Sarpedon's closest ally, prevented the prince from falling in that moment. The two retreated just far enough to regroup, swearing vengeance on the man who had nearly ended their fight for Troy. Elsewhere, Aeneas found himself face to face with the cunning Odysseus. The two circled each other warily, each aware of the other's reputation. Their duel was fierce and fast, their shields ringing with each blow. Though neither could land a decisive strike, the encounter forced both men back into their respective lines, each reassessing his strategy. The gods, ever watchful, continued to fan the flames. Hera, still furious at the judgment of Paris, whispered in Athena's ear, urging her to press the Greeks harder. Meanwhile, Aphrodite tended to the wounded Paris within Troy's walls, ensuring that he would live to fight, or provoke, another day. Ares himself appeared briefly on the Trojan side, his presence sending a surge of bloodlust through their ranks. Yet his influence was countered by Poseidon, who favored the Greeks and lent his strength to their leaders. As the sun dipped lower, the battle showed no sign of slowing. Both sides had suffered heavy losses, yet neither was willing to yield. The ground was littered with the fallen, their lifeless forms lying where they had stood moments before, and the cries of the dying mingled with the clash of arms. Chariots rolled over the plain, their drivers urging their steeds to ever greater speeds, the wheels splashing through pools of blood. In the final hours of the day, Hector rallied his men for one last push. With a voice that carried above the din, he called upon the honor of Troy, urging them to drive the Greeks back to their ships. His words struck deep into the hearts of his warriors, and they surged forward with renewed vigor. The Achaeans, however, met them blow for blow, their resolve hard as the bronze they carried. The fighting only ceased when darkness finally descended, cloaking the plain in shadow. Neither side could claim victory, and the truce that had once promised peace now lay shattered beyond repair. The war had entered a new phase, one where rage, not reason, would guide the hand, and where the will of the gods would continue to weave its unseen threads through the fates of mortal men. Night had barely settled over the plain when the groans of the wounded began to fill the air. Fires flickered in both camps, casting long shifting shadows over the weary faces of the soldiers. The dead lay where they had fallen, for neither side dared to venture too far into the darkness to retrieve them. Only the vultures and dogs prowled freely now, waiting for the first light of dawn to claim their grim feast. In the Achaean camp, the leaders gathered in Agamemnon's tent. The heavy smell of sweat, blood, and wine filled the space as they discussed the day's events. No one spoke of peace, only of how to gain the advantage when the fighting resumed. Agamemnon's pride had been bruised by the near rout his forces had suffered in the afternoon. He blamed the absence of Achilles for their inability to press the Trojans back toward their walls. Diomedes, his arm bound from a cut he had taken in the shoulder, spoke bluntly, telling the king that they could not win without their greatest champion. Odysseus agreed, urging Agamemnon to make amends with Achilles before the war turned irreversibly against them. But the high king of the Achaeans was not ready to bow his head. Instead, he promised to redouble the assault in the morning, confident that sheer force would break the Trojan lines. Across the plain in the great halls of Troy, Hector stood before his father, King Priam. The day's fighting had taken a heavy toll on his body. His armor was dented, his limbs ached from hours of combat, but his mind was already on the battles to come. Priam, aged yet sharp, listened to his son's account of the day with a mixture of pride and worry. Troy had withstood the Greeks for nearly a decade, but Hector knew the tide could turn at any moment. He urged the king to strengthen the gates, to bring the women and children deeper into the city, and to prepare for the worst. That night, as the warriors slept fitfully, the gods held council on Olympus. Zeus sat upon his high throne, his face unreadable as the lesser gods argued over the fate of Troy and the Greeks. Hera demanded that the Achaeans be given the upper hand, still burning with anger over Paris's judgment. Athena supported her, reminding Zeus that the Trojans had already broken their oaths. Apollo, ever the protector of Troy, countered fiercely, vowing to lend his bow to Hector's cause. Ares, restless and bloodthirsty, cared little for who triumphed, only that the war continued. By dawn, the decisions made in the divine council were already shaping the mortal field. A heavy mist clung to the ground as the armies assembled once more. The Achaeans formed their ranks with grim determination, the creak of leather and the clink of bronze filling the cold morning air. The Trojans poured out of the Scaean gate, their war cries echoing off the plain. The first clash of the day came swiftly. Ajax the Lesser led a charge on the Achaean left, hoping to drive a wedge into the Trojan flank. The effort met with fierce resistance, as Aeneas countered with a disciplined line of spearmen. The two forces locked in a brutal push of shields, each side straining to gain even a few paces of ground. In the center, Diomedes once again carved a bloody path through the Trojan ranks, his spear flashing in the light as if guided by Athena herself. Hector, seeing his men faltering, drove his chariot straight into the thick of the fighting. The force of his arrival sent shockwaves through the Achaean line, and for a moment, it seemed the Greeks might break. But Odysseus, rallying those nearest him, called for the line to hold. With a surge of effort, they steadied their formation and forced the Trojans back step by step. The battle raged on with unrelenting ferocity. Spears splintered, swords dulled, and shields cracked under the weight of the blows. The plain became slick with blood, making the footing treacherous for men and horses alike. Chariots crashed into one another, their drivers thrown into the melee to fight on foot. Amid the chaos, the gods continued to weave their influence. Apollo's arrows found the throats of Greek captains, while Athena turned aside the spears aimed at Diomedes and Odysseus. As the hours passed, the Trojans began to gain the upper hand. A sudden push on the Achaean right, led by Sarpedon and Glaucus, broke through the defensive line, forcing the Greeks to fall back toward their camp. The wooden fortifications around the ships loomed closer, and the thought of losing them filled the Achaeans with dread. Without their ships there would be no retreat, no way home. Agamemnon, sensing the danger, threw himself into the fight. Though the king was not the equal of the great champions, his presence inspired his men. He cut down 2 Trojan warriors in quick succession, driving his men forward. Yet even his efforts could not completely halt the Trojan advance. The clash surged ever closer to the Greek camp, the cries of the wounded mingling with the shouts of alarm from the sailors guarding the ships. It was in this desperate hour that the thought of Achilles returned to every Greek mind. Envoys were sent to plead with him once more. Odysseus, Ajax the Greater, and Phoenix, Achilles' old mentor, went to his tent under a white flag. They found him playing the lyre, singing songs of past heroes, as if the war outside his walls were nothing more than a distant storm. The envoys spoke with urgency, offering him gifts, gold, tripods, women taken from Troy, and even the return of Briseis, the woman who had been taken from him by Agamemnon. But Achilles remained unmoved. His pride, wounded by Agamemnon's insult, outweighed even his thirst for glory. He told the envoys that he had no wish to fight for a cause that had brought him only dishonor. Unless the Trojans threatened his own ships, he would remain apart from the war. With heavy hearts, the envoys returned to the battlefield, knowing their mission had failed. By afternoon, the Trojans had driven the Greeks back to the very edge of their camp. Hector, sensing victory, called for a final assault. His voice rang out over the din, urging his men to set the Greek ships aflame. The Achaeans, desperate, formed a tight defensive ring around the vessels. Ajax the Greater stood at the forefront, his great shield absorbing the rain of spears and arrows. Diomedes and Odysseus fought side by side, cutting down any Trojan who came too close. The fighting reached its climax as the sun began to set. The air was thick with dust and the screams of the dying. Flames licked at the edges of the Greek fortifications as the Trojans hurled burning torches over the walls. A single torch landed on the deck of a ship, and smoke began to curl into the air. Panic threatened to spread through the Greek ranks, but Ajax's booming voice and unyielding presence kept them from breaking. Darkness finally brought the struggle to a halt, but the damage was done. The Greeks had been pushed to the brink, their morale shaken, their greatest warrior still absent. In Troy, celebrations began, for it seemed that the long war might finally be turning in their favor. Yet Hector knew better than to believe the victory was secure. As long as the Greeks still held their ships, the threat remained. And somewhere in the camp, Achilles waited, his wrath simmering ready to be unleashed. The next day dawned under a sky of pale gold, the air heavy with the smell of trampled grass and dried blood. The plain between Troy and the Greek camp lay eerily quiet at first, as though both sides were reluctant to break the uneasy pause that had settled after the previous day's brutal fighting. Yet it was not long before the horns began to sound. From the Scaean gate, the Trojans emerged in tight ranks, shields overlapping, spears raised, their banners fluttering in the morning breeze. Across the field, the Greeks formed their own lines, tightening the straps of their armor and checking the edges of their blades. This day, however, would begin differently. Rather than a full-scale assault, the challenge of single combat had been issued. It had been Hector's proposal, meant both to test the enemy's courage and to spare his own troops from yet another day of heavy losses. The terms were simple. One champion from each side would face the other in the sight of both armies. The victor's people would gain the honor of the day, though the war itself would not yet end. The duel would be both a trial of strength and a gesture toward the traditions of warrior honor that still held sway, even amid a decade of bloodshed. Agamemnon had called a council of the Greek leaders to decide who should fight. Many champions stepped forward, eager for the glory, but also aware of the risk. Odysseus, shrewd as always, warned that they must choose someone who could stand against Hector's unmatched skill without leaving the rest of the army dangerously weakened if he fell. Diomedes, though still nursing the wound in his shoulder, volunteered without hesitation, but the council persuaded him to wait until he had fully healed. At last, Ajax the Greater was chosen, a giant among men known for his towering stature, immense shield and unshakable resolve. On the Trojan side the choice was already clear. Hector himself would take the field. He had fought from the first day of the war, never shirking the heaviest blows, never asking another man to do what he would not. His decision to fight was as much about maintaining his own honor as it was about bolstering the morale of his people. When the duel began, the two armies stood in perfect silence, watching the champions step into the no-man's land between them. Hector, clad in bronze that caught the light like fire, stood tall and calm. Ajax approached carrying his massive shield, the great wall of oxhide and bronze that was his hallmark. They saluted each other briefly, a sign that for all the hatred between their peoples, the warriors' code still bound them. The first clash came with the sound of bronze on bronze, Hector's spear striking Ajax's shield with a force that made even the Greek ranks murmur. Ajax countered with a thrust aimed at Hector's breastplate, but the Trojan prince twisted aside at the last moment. They circled, probing for weaknesses, the dust rising around their feet. Every movement was watched intently by the thousands on either side, for in this moment the fate of the day rested on two men alone. Hector's speed was formidable, his attacks fluid and relentless, but Ajax's sheer size and strength gave him the advantage in raw power. Twice Hector's spear glanced harmlessly off Ajax's shield, and twice Ajax's own strikes drove Hector back a step. Still, neither could land a fatal blow. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became oppressive, and sweat streaked their faces beneath their helmets. At last, Hector hurled his spear with all his strength. The weapon struck Ajax's shield dead center, driving him back but failing to pierce through. In the same breath, Ajax seized a massive stone from the ground and hurled it at Hector. The rock slammed into the Trojan's shield with such force that it nearly knocked him from his feet. The watching Trojans cried out, but Hector steadied himself, refusing to fall. The duel might have continued until one man dropped, but as the shadows lengthened, heralds from both sides stepped forward to call an end. The sun was setting, and by custom, fighting after dark between champions was forbidden. Reluctantly, the two warriors lowered their weapons. They exchanged gifts, a sign of mutual respect despite their enmity. Hector gave Ajax a finely crafted sword with a silver hilt, while Ajax offered Hector a broad belt of purple-dyed leather. The duel had no decisive victor, yet both sides claimed a measure of honor. For the Greeks, Ajax had stood unbroken against Troy's greatest defender. For the Trojans, Hector had faced one of the mightiest of the Achaeans without yielding ground. The armies withdrew for the night, their minds already turning to what the next day would bring. Yet the pause in the slaughter offered an opportunity that neither side wished to waste. With the duel concluded, envoys began to move quietly between the camps. In the Greek camp, Nestor, the wise old king of Pylos, suggested that perhaps now was the moment to explore terms for peace, if only to buy time and spare more lives. Agamemnon, though still stubborn, listened. The losses had been heavy, and the morale of the troops was fraying. A truce, even a temporary one, might give them a chance to regroup. In Troy, Priam was open to discussions as well, though for different reasons. The city's resources were strained and the people were weary. The constant funerals had cast a shadow over even the most joyful occasions. Yet there could be no settlement without addressing the cause of the war, Helen. Paris, her abductor, remained defiant, unwilling to return her to Menelaus. His pride and his love, whether genuine or born of desire, were immovable. That night, under the cover of darkness, envoys from both sides met in a small tent set apart from the main camps. From the Greek side came Odysseus and Menelaus, along with a few trusted companions. From Troy came Antenor, an elder statesman known for his wisdom, and 2 other advisors to Priam. The conversation was measured but tense. The Greeks demanded the return of Helen and the treasures taken with her. The Trojans countered with offers of gold and gifts, but not the woman herself. Menelaus, his voice hard with years of anger, refused outright. To him the matter was not about wealth but about honor. Helen's return was the only acceptable outcome. Odysseus, though more pragmatic, understood that without Helen, the Greek kings would never agree to lay down their arms. The meeting ended without agreement, though both sides agreed to maintain the fragile truce for the next day. Back in their respective camps, the leaders weighed their options. For the Greeks, the lack of progress meant they would soon have to fight again, and without Achilles, their position remained precarious. For the Trojans, the knowledge that their walls could withstand the Greeks for now was tempered by the fear that the war could drag on for years more. At dawn, the truce was broken, not by order of the kings, but by the restless will of the warriors themselves. A small skirmish between scouts on the edge of the plain reignited the fury of both armies. Within hours, the full scale of battle had returned, the memory of the duel and the peace talks fading under the roar of war cries and the clash of bronze. The clash that reignited the war after the truce began with a small, almost accidental act. Near the edge of the plain, a group of Trojan scouts spotted a Greek patrol moving toward a nearby stream to collect water. The 2 groups recognized one another instantly, and a few taunting words quickly escalated into thrown spears. One Greek fell, and in moments both sides were shouting for reinforcements. By the time the main forces realized what had happened, the momentum toward battle was impossible to stop. Hector, hearing the commotion, donned his armor without hesitation. His duel with Ajax the day before had left him sore but uninjured, and he felt the duty to lead his men in person. As he strode from the Scaean gate, his troops rallied around him. The Greeks, equally stirred by the insult of the attack, surged forward under the command of Agamemnon and Diomedes, the latter refusing to remain idle despite his healing wound. The plain erupted in chaos. Spearmen met shield to shield, their bronze edges biting into flesh. Arrows darkened the sky, loosed from the ramparts of Troy and the Greek archers stationed behind their front lines. The sound was deafening, the crash of armor, the cries of the wounded, and the steady pounding of thousands of feet trampling the dry earth. Odysseus maneuvered on the Greek left flank, leading a smaller contingent to outflank the Trojans. His strategy was clear: force them to split their attention and weaken their front. But Aeneas, cousin to Hector and one of Troy's most capable commanders, anticipated the move. He countered with a swift redirection of cavalry, cutting off Odysseus's advance and forcing him into a tight defensive circle. In the midst of the fighting, 2 duels began to stand out from the general slaughter. On the Greek side, Diomedes spotted Aeneas among the Trojan ranks and pushed through the chaos to face him. Aeneas, remembering their previous encounter, when Diomedes had nearly killed him before the gods intervened, accepted the challenge without hesitation. Their spears clashed with deadly force, each man testing the other's reflexes and endurance. Diomedes, despite the pain in his shoulder, pressed hard, his relentless aggression keeping Aeneas from taking the offensive. Yet Aeneas's skill in defense kept him alive, his shield absorbing blow after blow. Meanwhile, toward the center of the field, Menelaus came face to face with Paris. It was a meeting both had anticipated since the start of the war, for it was Paris's theft of Helen that had sparked the entire conflict. Menelaus, consumed by years of rage, charged at him with reckless speed. Paris loosed an arrow which glanced harmlessly off Menelaus's armor. In the next moment, Menelaus's spear shattered against Paris's shield, forcing him to draw his sword. Paris fought back, but his strikes lacked the raw power of his opponents. Menelaus battered him back, each blow bringing him closer to ending the man who had dishonored him. Just as Menelaus raised his sword for the final strike, Paris vanished from his reach, spirited away by a sudden mist. Aphrodite herself, unwilling to see her favored mortal slain, had intervened. Paris reappeared safely within Troy's walls, humiliated but alive. Menelaus, denied his vengeance, roared in frustration, his sword cutting only empty air. The fighting raged for hours, the dust rising so thick that at times soldiers could barely see the man in front of them. Casualties mounted on both sides, the bodies of friend and foe alike lying tangled where they fell. Nestor, watching from the rear, urged Agamemnon to pull the Greek forces back before they suffered unsustainable losses. Reluctantly, Agamemnon agreed, signaling for a controlled retreat to the defensive wall they had built around their ships. Hector saw the withdrawal and ordered a relentless pursuit. His chariots thundered across the plain, cutting down stragglers. The Greeks barely managed to reach the safety of their fortifications before the Trojans reached them. The battle shifted to the gates of the Greek wall, with Hector himself leading the assault. Massive stones were hurled against the gates and ladders were raised to the walls. The defenders rained arrows and spears down on the attackers, but the Trojans pressed forward with grim determination. It was during this desperate defense that another notable single combat occurred, this time between Hector and the mighty Ajax once again. From atop the wall, Ajax hurled enormous boulders down at the Trojan assault. One such stone struck a chariot near Hector, shattering its axle and sending the driver sprawling. Hector, enraged, charged toward the gate, calling for the Trojans to follow. Ajax, recognizing the danger, leapt down from the wall to meet him. Their second clash was even more brutal than the first. There was no ceremony now, no exchange of gifts, only the raw intent to kill. Hector's spear struck glancing blows on Ajax's armor, while Ajax's shield absorbed the worst of Hector's attacks. They traded strikes in quick succession, each one forcing the other back a step. Yet neither man could gain the upper hand for long. The tide of the larger battle soon forced them apart, as the Greeks managed to push the Trojans back from the gate with a concentrated volley of missiles. Both warriors withdrew to rally their men, but the memory of their renewed fight stayed in the minds of those who witnessed it. As evening approached, the fighting finally began to subside. Exhaustion, not agreement, brought the day's battle to a close. The Greeks remained behind their walls, battered but intact. The Trojans, though unable to breach the defenses, claimed the day as a victory for having driven their enemies into retreat. That night, the leaders of both armies convened once more. In the Trojan camp, Hector pressed for a renewed assault the next morning, believing the Greeks were weakened and demoralized. Antenor, however, urged caution. He proposed sending Helen and part of the treasure back to the Greeks as a way to end the war on favorable terms before fortune turned against them. Priam listened in silence, torn between his son's desire for glory and his elder's plea for prudence. In the Greek camp the mood was grim. Agamemnon, frustrated by the day's losses, spoke openly of the possibility of sailing home. It was Odysseus and Diomedes who argued against it, reminding the kings that abandoning the siege now would be an unerasable mark of shame. They agreed instead to send envoys to Achilles once more, offering richer gifts in the hope of bringing him back into the fight. The night passed under a tense stillness, broken only by the distant cries of the wounded in both camps. The moon cast a pale light over the plain, illuminating the scars of the day's combat, broken spears, shattered shields, and the still forms of fallen warriors. Even in sleep, the men dreamed of the next day's bloodshed. The dawn after the brutal clash rose heavy with a reddish haze, the dust of the plain still lingering in the air from the previous day's fighting. Both armies emerged from their camps slower than usual, their movements heavy from exhaustion. But there was no mistaking the fact that battle would come again. The truce was long gone, and with it the last threads of restraint. On the Trojan side, Hector wasted no time rallying his forces. The victory of the previous day, though incomplete, had lifted morale. He called for the chariots to be readied and the infantry to form ranks. Priam, watching from the city walls, silently prayed to the gods that his eldest son's confidence would not lead to disaster. In the Greek camp, Agamemnon's face was a mask of resolve. During the night, envoys had been sent once more to Achilles. They had returned without him. Achilles had refused every offer: gifts of gold, the return of Briseis, promises of honor. His pride was unshaken, and his absence continued to cast a long shadow over the Greek army. Agamemnon, aware that another day's loss could shatter the siege, placed his trust in the remaining champions. The armies met again on the plain, the space between them narrowing under the steady tramp of boots and the roll of wheels. Before the first general charge could begin, a lone figure stepped forward from the Trojan side, Prince Deiphobus, one of Hector's brothers. He raised his voice over the distance, challenging any Greek willing to face him in single combat. It was Antilochus, the swift son of Nestor, who accepted. He stepped from the Greek lines, his youth and speed a match for Deiphobus's strength and experience. The two met between the armies, circling warily before their first clash. Antilochus struck first, his spear darting toward Deiphobus's shoulder. The Trojan deflected it with his shield and countered with a thrust aimed low, forcing Antilochus to leap back. Blow followed blow, their movements fast enough to draw cheers from both sides. Finally, Antilochus feinted high and then swept low, his spear cutting across Deiphobus's thigh. Wounded, the Trojan retreated, and the Greeks roared in triumph. But the duel had served its purpose. It stirred the blood of both armies, and moments later the full battle began. The Greeks pushed hard in the early fighting. Ajax, towering above his comrades, drove his spear into the heart of the Trojan left flank. Diomedes returned to the front with renewed fury, scattering opponents before him. Odysseus led a precise and ruthless assault, breaking through a smaller Trojan unit and sowing confusion in their lines. The Trojans countered with their own champions. Hector cut a path through the Greek ranks with each sweep of his sword, and Aeneas, spurred by the memory of his unfinished duel with Diomedes, sought him out again. Their renewed fight was brutal, each warrior pressing the other to the limits of endurance. Aeneas's shield rang with the force of Diomedes' strikes, while Diomedes dodged the heavy thrusts aimed at his unprotected side. At last, a sudden rush of Trojan infantry forced Diomedes back, ending the duel without a clear victor. While the battle raged, the undercurrent of diplomacy still pulsed through the war. Antenor, the wise elder of Troy, moved quietly among the Trojan officers, speaking of the costs of endless fighting. He met privately with a pair of Greek envoys under a flag of truce, not to surrender, but to test the possibility of a negotiated settlement. The terms discussed were fragile at best: the return of Helen without the treasure in exchange for the Greeks lifting the siege. The envoys carried the message back to Agamemnon, but the High King dismissed it at once. Helen, he declared, would be returned with all her treasure, or not at all. Back on the battlefield, the fight reached its fiercest point near midday. It was then that another duel of note occurred, between Sarpedon, the Lycian prince and son of Zeus, and the Greek hero Lipolemus, son of Heracles. Their clash was fueled by old grudges, each blaming the other's family for past wrongs. They met with such force that both spears struck true, Sarpedon's piercing Lipolemus' side, and Lipolemus wounding Sarpedon in the thigh. Lipolemus fell and was carried from the field, his wound mortal. Sarpedon, though bleeding heavily, refused to withdraw, fighting on with the grim determination of one who knew his fate was drawing near. In the chaos, Hector spotted an opportunity. The Greeks' right flank, overextended in pursuit of retreating Trojans, had left a gap near their defensive wall. Hector drove his chariots toward it, aiming to breach the wall itself. The defenders fought desperately, hurling stones and spears to slow the attack. At one point, Hector himself seized a massive stone and, with a roar, hurled it against the gates. The impact splintered the wood, sending shards flying into the defenders. The breach was nearly complete when Ajax appeared once more, his massive shield blocking Hector's path. The two titans clashed for a third time, and the space around them seemed to clear as soldiers instinctively stepped back. Hector's sword clanged against Ajax's shield, sparks flying. Ajax's spear struck Hector's helmet, denting the bronze and forcing him to stumble. But just as Ajax prepared to press his advantage, a wave of Trojan spearmen surged forward, forcing him to retreat to the wall. The gates held for now. By late afternoon, the battle began to ebb. Both sides had taken heavy losses, and the heat of the day was draining the last reserves of strength. Hector ordered a withdrawal before darkness could trap his men too far from the safety of Troy's gates. The Greeks, battered but unbroken, reinforced their defenses and tended to the wounded. That night, the war shifted from the plain to the realm of negotiation once again. Priam convened a secret council, attended by Hector, Paris, Aeneas, and Antenor. Voices clashed in the torchlit chamber, Hector arguing for total war, Antenor urging a settlement, and Paris refusing to give up Helen at all. In the end, no agreement was reached. The council dissolved with the same division that had plagued Troy since the start of the war. Across the plain, the Greek leaders held their own council. Nestor advised caution, warning that without Achilles their chances of storming Troy were slim. Odysseus proposed a different approach: weaken Troy through smaller, targeted strikes rather than risking the full army in pitched battles. Agamemnon agreed reluctantly, his pride still smarting from the repeated stalemates. The night was restless for both armies. Fires burned along the walls of Troy and around the Greek camp, casting flickering shadows that seemed almost like advancing warriors in the darkness. The wounded groaned in the tents, and the sentries gripped their spears tightly, expecting another attack before dawn. Far from the camps, in the quiet between the lines, a few brave envoys from both sides met in secret. They spoke not of surrender, but of exchanging the dead so that each army could honor their fallen. For a moment, the war was suspended in this small act of shared humanity. Under the cold light of the moon, the bodies were carried away, Greeks and Trojans alike, proof that even amid endless bloodshed some oaths could still be kept. By the next morning, both armies knew that the fragile gestures of diplomacy had done nothing to end the war. The duels would continue, the battles would rage, and each side would keep looking for the decisive moment when blades or bargains could finally bring Troy's fate to its close. The sun's last light clung stubbornly to the western horizon, streaking the sky above Troy in bruised shades of violet and ember red. From the Greek camp, the towers of the city looked like jagged teeth against the fading glow, each battlement already touched by the cold silver of the rising moon. The long day's battles had quieted. The clangor of swords and the cries of dying men had given way to a hush that was, in its own way, heavier than war's roar. Even the sea seemed subdued, its waves whispering along the beach as if unwilling to wake the weary armies. Yet in that stillness, the seeds of danger were already sown. The fragile lines between both sides were stretched thin, not by diplomacy but by sheer exhaustion. The brief truces that had been declared in daylight, temporary pauses to retrieve bodies, to tend to the wounded, were gone now. The campfires of the Achaeans burned in steady rows, guarded but restless, each flame throwing shadows that danced on weathered faces. Far across the plain, Troy's walls stood lit with torches, golden dots floating in the dark like distant stars. The two sides, though separated by the plain, seemed bound by an invisible tension, a taut wire ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Agamemnon stood in the main command tent, bent over a map lit by oil lamps. The heavy folds of the tent's canvas flapped faintly in the night breeze, carrying with them the mingled smells of salt air, sweat, and smoldering firewood. Around the map's edges stood the war council, Odysseus, his sharp eyes flickering between the lines of the drawn plain, Diomedes, ever impatient, shifting his weight like a warhorse before the charge, and Menelaus, whose gaze was fixed not on the map but on the vague direction of Troy, where Helen slept behind its walls. "We cannot keep this deadlock forever," Agamemnon said, his voice low but edged with command. "The Trojans will not break in daylight, not yet. But night offers chances." Odysseus leaned closer to the table, tracing a line along the river Scamander with his finger. "The watch changes every few hours along the Trojan walls. Their eastern gate is lightly guarded until the moon reaches its highest point. If we were to send men, not an army but a shadow, through the plain under cover of darkness." "Spies," Diomedes finished, a spark in his eyes. "Find their plants. Count their numbers. Perhaps, take a head or two of their captains." The idea was dangerous, even reckless. Night raids were the work of men who accepted they might never return. But in this war, information was as valuable as spears and shields. A single report of weakness, a gap in Troy's defense, could tilt the balance. Agamemnon's gaze moved from one man to the next. "Who will do this?" Diomedes didn't hesitate. "I will go. My legs are quick, my eyes keen." "I will not let you go alone," said Odysseus. "Cunning is needed as much as strength tonight. And if we are caught, 2 blades are better than 1. There was no further debate. The plan was set in minutes, quiet, swift, and without the rousing speeches of daylight. A raid by torchlight was suicide. This would be a mission of whispers and shadows. By the time the moon had climbed halfway to its zenith, Diomedes and Odysseus were ready. Their armor was stripped of anything that might shine. Leather straps replaced gleaming bronze buckles, and their shields were slung across their backs, faces inward to hide their bright bronze rims. Each carried a short spear and a sword, the blades dulled with ash to prevent moonlight from glinting off the metal. They slipped from the camp like phantoms, moving along the edges of the trench and wall that ringed the Achaean ships. The guards at the gates nodded but did not speak. Men chosen for such a mission needed no farewells. Once beyond the protective earthworks, the night seemed to press closer. The plain between Troy and the ships stretched before them, wide and empty, but the emptiness was an illusion. Somewhere in that darkness, Trojan scouts prowled, and more than one warrior had been found with an arrow in his back before he ever reached the other side. The two men moved with a hunter's patience, crouching low where the land dipped, freezing when the distant clop of hooves or the crunch of boots on dry soil reached their ears. The moonlight painted their path in silver and shadow, forcing them to time each step to the clouds that drifted across its face. Halfway across the plain they heard it, a murmur of voices low and urgent. Diomedes signaled for silence and dropped to one knee. Ahead, barely visible in the gloom, were two figures. They moved not toward Troy but away from it, slipping toward the Greek side. The stranger's armor was strange, lighter, more fitted than Trojan bronze, and each carried a curved blade at the hip. "Not ours," Odysseus whispered. "Nor Trojans," Diomedes muttered. "Mercenaries? Scouts from another ally?" They decided to follow, each step a silent echo of the men ahead. The strangers moved swiftly, angling toward a small grove of trees near the riverbank. There, in the partial cover, the two figures paused, speaking in a tongue neither Greek nor Trojan. Before they could react, one of the strangers turned sharply, eyes catching a fragment of moonlight. The chase exploded without warning. Diomedes sprang forward, his spear leveled. One of the strangers darted back into the trees, but the other drew his blade, its curve flashing faintly in the dark. The clash was brief, a handful of strikes, steel on steel in the hush of night, before Diomedes' strength overpowered the man. Odysseus caught the other as he tried to slip away, tripping him with a sweep of the spear shaft. When the dust settled, the truth became stranger still. The captives were from Thrace, allies of Troy who had been moving between the city and a camp further north. They carried maps, sketches of the Achaean defenses, and notes written in hurried strokes. Information meant for Priam's generals. "Spies," Odysseus said grimly. "Not ours but theirs." Killing them would have been simple, but the two Greeks chose instead to use them. Gagged and bound, the Thracians were dragged along as Diomedes and Odysseus continued toward Troy, the thought of turning the enemy's own scouts against them adding fuel to their mission. Beyond the river, the land began to slope upward toward Troy's massive walls. From here, the city seemed almost asleep, its gates closed, the watchtowers lit but quiet. But the silence was deceptive. Every torch meant a pair of eyes. Every shadow could hide an archer. Odysseus crouched low behind a cluster of rocks, studying the eastern gate. As he'd predicted, its guard was thin, only a handful of soldiers stood along the ramparts. The main attention was on the western walls, where most Achaean attacks had been launched in daylight. "This is the place," he murmured. But just as they prepared to move, a sound reached them from the far side of the wall, a horn low and drawn out. It was not an alarm. It was a signal. Within moments, the gate shifted, opening just wide enough for a small group to emerge. Figures cloaked in black slipped through, their movements precise and deliberate. These were no ordinary soldiers. They carried satchels, not spears, and moved in pairs, speaking in urgent whispers. Messengers, Diomedes guessed. Or assassins. The possibilities multiplied quickly in Odysseus' mind. If these were agents of Troy sent under the cover of night, their target could be the Greek camp itself. The thought hardened his resolve. "We follow." And so the mission changed. No longer was it only about gathering information, it was about intercepting a threat before it reached the ships. The chase would lead them deeper into danger than they had planned, drawing them into the heart of the night's web of espionage, where every step forward meant risking discovery, and every shadow might hold the glint of a waiting blade. The moon's pale light crept over Troy's high battlements, casting elongated shadows that seemed to sway like dark sentinels in the night breeze. The walls still bore the scars of countless assaults, arrows embedded between the stones, scorch marks where Greek fire had licked the ramparts, and places where the stone had been chipped away by relentless siege engines. Yet the city still stood. That survival, however, was becoming less a matter of strength and more a test of endurance, and both sides knew it. Inside the Greek camp, the air was heavy with anticipation. Around a low fire, Odysseus, Diomedes, and a small cadre of hand-picked warriors crouched, their faces half-lit by the flickering flames. The murmur of the camp, the snoring of exhausted soldiers, the stamping of restless horses, faded in their ears as they reviewed the plan for the night. The Greeks had been fighting this war for nearly a decade, and while brute force had failed to bring Troy down, cunning might yet succeed. Odysseus's mind, sharp and tireless, was already moving pieces in a game far larger than the night's mission alone. The target was not merely an enemy soldier but an advantage. A man named Dolon, a Trojan spy who often crept between the Greek lines to gather intelligence. If they could capture him alive, they might pry from him knowledge of Troy's night patrols, its hidden supply routes, or even the movements of Hector's elite guard. Every scrap of information was now worth more than a dozen warriors in battle. The two slipped away from camp like wraiths, their armor wrapped in dark cloth to dull any glint of moonlight. The guards on the perimeter barely noticed them pass. Such movements were not unusual when scouts were on the hunt. Odysseus carried a short, curved blade at his hip and a coil of rope across his shoulder. Diomedes had his spear, though he kept its point lowered so it wouldn't catch the light. Both men knew that the key to this mission was silence. One careless step could alert the Trojans. Beyond the outer ring of the Greek camp, the open field between the armies stretched into darkness, a no-man's land littered with the remnants of battle. Broken shields, shattered chariots, and the still forms of fallen men dotted the ground, reminders of the day's carnage. The grass whispered under their feet as they moved, the faint smell of blood still hanging in the air. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a sound that seemed to belong more to the battlefield than the wilderness. It wasn't long before they spotted him. Dolon moved low and fast, his thin frame blending into the night. He wore a wolf pelt over his shoulders, perhaps in some misguided hope that its outline would fool the Greek sentries. But Odysseus had been expecting him. The spy's path cut too directly toward the Greek camp to be anything else. With a quick nod, the two Greeks separated, circling wide to cut off his retreat. When the moment came, Diomedes struck first, stepping from the shadows to block Dolon's path. The Trojan froze, eyes widening as the moonlight caught the glint of the spearhead. Odysseus emerged silently behind him, the rope already in his hands. Before Dolon could cry out, the rope was around his neck and his arms were pinned to his sides. The struggle was brief. The spy was no match for two seasoned warriors. Dragged to a secluded hollow, Dolon's fear was palpable. Odysseus's voice was calm but cold as he questioned the man, offering him a choice between truth and a swift end. The wolf pelt trembled on Dolon's back as he spoke, the words spilling out in a rush. Hector's chariots were stationed on the northern plain, the Thracian allies had arrived and were camped apart from the main army, and the Trojans planned to rotate their sentries at the third watch of the night. More importantly, Dolon revealed that the Thracian camp, led by their king Rhesus, was poorly guarded. Their horses, swift as the wind, could be stolen before they were ever used in battle. Odysseus and Diomedes exchanged a glance. This was the kind of opportunity they had hoped for. The Thracian cavalry could tip the balance of the war if allowed to ride against the Greeks. Eliminating them before dawn would not only weaken Troy's allies but also send a chilling message to any who might consider joining their cause. With no further use for him, Dolon was dispatched swiftly. His body was left where it would not be easily found, and the two Greeks set their sights on the Thracian camp. The night seemed to hold its breath as they moved deeper into enemy territory. Troy's outer watchfires glimmered in the distance, but the Thracian camp lay in a darker pocket of the plain, its warriors sleeping soundly after a day's march. Diomedes led the way, slipping past the few sentries who lounged drowsily at the camp's edge. The Thracian tents were arranged in loose rows, their white hides glowing faintly under the moon. In the center, Rhesus's horses, tall, pale creatures with manes like silver, shifted restlessly in their pen. The slaughter began in silence. Moving from tent to tent, Diomedes cut down the sleeping warriors before they could wake, while Odysseus loosed the horses and tied them to a lead rope. By the time a cry rang out, the camp was already in chaos, and the Greeks were gone into the night, driving the stolen horses ahead of them. Back in their own camp, the Greeks received the returning heroes with quiet awe. No horns blared, no songs were sung. It was not yet time to reveal the blow they had struck. But word spread quickly among the officers. The Thracians were no longer a threat, and Hector would wake to find one of his most valuable allies gone. Meanwhile, inside Troy's walls, unease began to gnaw at the defenders. Rumors of spies and assassins spread through the barracks. Who could be trusted? How had the Greeks known where to strike? Hector, pacing in the torchlight of the war council chamber, clenched his jaw as he listened to conflicting reports. Every night seemed to bring a new threat, and the soldiers were growing weary. He knew the Greeks would exploit this unrest if they could. The moon sank lower and the city held its breath. Somewhere in the quiet, a door opened for betrayal, and both armies inched closer to the breaking point. The shadows before dawn were darker than ever, and when the sun rose again, it would shine on a world changed by what had passed in the night. The first pale streaks of dawn were still an hour away, but the city of Troy was not sleeping. In the highest towers, sentries leaned over the battlements, peering into the dark plain beyond the walls. The fires of the Greek camp burned low, but that quiet glow was misleading. The night had already been one of losses. News of the Thracian slaughter had reached the city just before midnight, and the shock had rippled through the ranks like a cold wind. The Thracians had been strong allies, their cavalry unmatched, and now they were gone, killed in their tents without even the chance to lift a sword. Hector had been the first to hear the grim report. A lone rider from the Thracian camp had escaped the carnage and reached Troy's gates, his voice breaking as he described the slaughter. The worst of it was the knowledge that the Greeks had known exactly where to strike and when. That meant one thing: someone inside Troy had spoken. The council chamber beneath Priam's palace was thick with the smell of oil lamps and the tension of men who no longer trusted one another. Priam sat in silence at the head of the long table, his hands folded, his gaze fixed on the polished stone surface before him. Around him stood Hector, Paris, Antenor, and several of Troy's most senior advisors. The conversation moved in sharp bursts, accusations, denials, warnings. No one said it outright, but the thought hung in the air: there was a traitor among them. Paris, restless and quick to speak, insisted that the Greeks must have captured and tortured some hapless scout. Antenor countered that the details of the Thracian camp's location could only have come from someone within Troy's own war council. The older man's voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp, searching the faces around the table. Hector said nothing at first, but when he spoke, it was with the blunt force of command: "If there is a traitor, we will find him. And when we do, I will see his body hanging from the walls." Outside the palace, the streets were quieter than usual. Merchants delayed setting up their stalls, and women carrying water kept their eyes lowered, as though speaking too loudly might summon ill fortune. The city was tired. 10 years of siege had worn down its strength, but the past weeks had been worse than any before. The Greeks were patient hunters, and their raids, swift, precise, and devastating, were bleeding Troy slowly, like a wound that never healed. That night, another shadow slipped out of Troy. His name was Mestor, a mid-ranking officer in the city guard, and his path through the narrow backstreets suggested he had made this journey before. Avoiding the main gates, he moved toward a sally port near the river, a hidden exit used by fishermen in peacetime. There, under the cover of thick reeds, a small boat waited. Mestor's strokes were quick and quiet, and soon he was across the shallow water and making his way toward the dark line of the Greek camp. In the camp, Mestor was not challenged. A pair of guards recognized him and let him pass without a word. He had been feeding the Greeks information for months, his reports carried to Odysseus through carefully timed meetings. His motives were not entirely clear. Some whispered of bribes, others of grudges against certain Trojan commanders, but whatever the reason, his betrayal had already cost lives. This night's message was urgent. Hector planned to rotate the watch on the northern wall earlier than usual, leaving a narrow gap when fewer men would be posted there. Odysseus listened intently, storing every detail. He knew that striking during that gap could be risky. The Trojans might still detect them, but it was the kind of opportunity that could cause real damage. Before sending Mestor back, he pressed a gold ring into the man's hand. The spy tucked it away, his face grim. In Troy, gold bought much, but it could not erase the risk of discovery. When Mestor slipped back into the city before dawn, he did not notice the silent figure watching him from the shadows. Euneus, a young captain loyal to Hector, had grown suspicious after noticing the officer's frequent absences. This time he followed. Keeping to the narrow alleys, Euneus tracked Mestor's movements until the man vanished into his home near the southern market. The young captain did not confront him immediately. Instead, he went straight to Hector. By mid-morning, Mestor was dragged from his home and brought before the war council. His denials were fierce, but under Hector's glare, his voice faltered. Witnesses were brought forward, men who had seen him leave the city at night, others who had noticed his strange absences during key moments of the siege. Still, no one could produce absolute proof. Priam, cautious and unwilling to act on suspicion alone, ordered Mestor imprisoned until further evidence could be found. Hector obeyed, though reluctantly. In his mind, the man's guilt was already certain. That evening, the Greeks launched their attack on the northern wall exactly as Mestor had described. They moved swiftly, their ladders scraping against the stone, arrows cutting down the few sentries who tried to resist. But Hector had anticipated them. He had doubled the guard in secret, keeping even his own officers unaware of the plan until the last moment. When the Greeks reached the top of the wall, they were met by a wall of shields and a storm of spears. The fight was brief and brutal. Those Greeks who survived the counterattack fled into the night. The victory was small but desperately needed. For the first time in weeks, the city's defenders felt a flicker of confidence. Yet Hector knew this was only a momentary reprieve. The Greeks would not stop, and the spy problem remained unsolved. If Mestor was not the only one, then there were others still feeding the enemy their secrets. Meanwhile, in the Greek camp, frustration grew. The failed night raid had cost them men and gained nothing. Agamemnon raged in his tent, blaming Odysseus for the plan's failure, while Menelaus muttered darkly about the need for a bolder strike. It was in moments like these that the divisions among the Greek leaders widened, each man eager for glory, each suspicious of the other's motives. Odysseus, however, was already thinking ahead. If the Trojans were alert to direct assaults, then the next step would have to be subtler. He began to weave the beginnings of a scheme that would involve deception on a scale the Trojans had never imagined. But that was for another day. For now, the game of shadows continued. In Troy, night fell once more. The streets emptied early, and the only sounds were the distant clink of armor from the walls and the low murmur of soldiers on patrol. Inside the prison, Mestor sat in the darkness, his mind racing. He knew that if he stayed here, sooner or later Hector would find the proof he needed, and his fate would be sealed. That left him with only one option: escape. The opportunity came when a sympathetic guard, perhaps bribed, perhaps blackmailed, unlocked his cell in the dead of night. Slipping into the streets, Mestor moved toward the same hidden sally port he had used before. But this time the shadows held more than darkness. Euneas was waiting. There was no confrontation, no shouted warning. The young captain's blade struck swiftly, and Mestor fell before he could even cry out. His body was dragged to the nearest watch post, where Hector was summoned to see the work for himself. The evidence, a gold ring from the Greek camp, was pried from the spy's dead hand. There would be no more doubts. Hector ordered the body displayed at the city gates by dawn, a warning to any who might think of following Mestor's path. When the sun rose, its first light fell on the lifeless form hanging from the walls, and both armies saw it. The Greeks knew they had lost a valuable informant. The Trojans knew that their prince would not hesitate to deal with betrayal. But even as the people of Troy took grim comfort in the execution, Hector's mind was elsewhere. The war was not decided, and he sensed that the Greeks were already plotting something new. The siege was no longer a contest of armies alone. It was a battle of minds, patience, and endurance. And in that battle, every night before dawn would bring the risk of another shadow slipping through the dark. The great camp of the Achaeans lay under a pall of frustration and fear. 4 days, the Trojans had pushed their advantage, pressing the Greeks back toward their ships. Without Achilles, the tide had shifted in favor of Hector and the armies of Troy. The quarrel between the son of Peleus and Agamemnon had grown into a wound that festered with every passing hour. Achilles, withdrawn to his tent, refused to take up arms. His Myrmidons, the fiercest of the Achaean warriors, stood idle with their armor polished but unused. The other Greek leaders knew that unless Achilles returned to the fight, the war might soon be lost. Patroclus, the constant companion of Achilles since boyhood, could not stand to watch his fellow warriors suffer. Day after day he heard the cries of the wounded, saw the smoke from burning ships, and felt the desperation seeping into the camp. He knew that Achilles' pride was unshakable, but his own heart was different, more concerned with the lives of men than the endless debate of honor between kings. His concern grew as the Trojans began to reach the very defenses of the Greek fleet. This morning the shouting from the walls was different. The Trojans had broken through the last trench, and Hector's chariots were rolling toward the ships. The clash of bronze on bronze and the shouts of men came from so close that the ground trembled under the weight of battle. Patroclus could wait no longer. He entered Achilles' tent, the heavy leather flap falling shut behind him. The air inside was thick with the scent of oil and the gleam of finely crafted weapons, all unused. Achilles sat apart, his lyre resting beside him, his eyes fixed on nothing. "Achilles," Patroclus began, his voice heavy with urgency, "our friends are dying out there. The Trojans are setting fire to the ships. If they burn them, there will be no way home, no hope of victory. Will you let the war be lost while you sit here in silence?" Achilles did not answer immediately. His jaw tightened, and when he spoke, it was with the cold edge of a man still wounded by insult. I swore I would not fight until Agamemnon's need for me was greater than his pride. Let them taste the bitterness of war without me. Then perhaps they will understand. Patroclus stepped closer. If you will not fight for Agamemnon, then fight for the men who have followed you since Phthia. Or, if you must hold to your oath, then at least let me lead the Myrmidons into battle. Lend me your armor so the Trojans will think you have returned. The sight of your crest will strike fear into their hearts and drive them back from the ships. Achilles studied him for a long moment. His eyes softened slightly, for his affection for Patroclus ran deep. Very well, he said at last, you may wear my armor and lead the Myrmidons. But hear me, Patroclus, drive the Trojans away from the ships, save our fleet and then return. Do not chase them to the walls of Troy. The glory of taking the city is not yours to seek. Patroclus nodded, though inside he felt the pull of a different destiny. He knew the dangers, but he also knew the weight of this moment. He left the tent and called for the Myrmidons. Around him the camp stirred. Word spread quickly, Achilles had returned, or so it seemed. Men lifted their heads, renewed hope flickering in their eyes. The Myrmidons, fierce and disciplined, gathered with speed. They were warriors trained from youth to follow Achilles into the heart of any battle. Their black armor gleamed in the sunlight, and their shields bore the marks of many past victories. Patroclus donned Achilles' armor piece by piece. The bronze was heavy but perfectly balanced, the work of the god Hephaestus himself. The great crest of the helmet shone, and the sight alone was enough to deceive the enemy from a distance. When Patroclus stepped forward, the Myrmidons knelt briefly in respect, ready to follow him without question. He mounted Achilles' chariot, drawn by the immortal horses Xanthus and Belius, gifts from the gods themselves. The charioteer Automedon took the reins, and together they wheeled toward the front lines. The Greek warriors who saw him pass cried out in renewed spirit. They shouted Achilles' name, believing their greatest champion had returned to save them. Across the plain, the Trojans too saw the figure in shining armor, and unease rippled through their ranks. Some faltered, remembering past encounters with the unstoppable son of Peleus. As Patroclus reached the thick of the fighting, the Myrmidons poured into the fray. They struck with precision, their spears finding the gaps in Trojan shields, their formation cutting through the enemy like a blade through cloth. Patroclus himself fought with fierce skill, each strike of his spear claiming a life, each step pushing the Trojans farther back. Around him, the clash of war was deafening, steel on steel, the cries of the dying, the shouts of commanders trying to rally their men. The Trojans, once so confident, began to retreat under the sudden onslaught. Patroclus drove them from the ships, fulfilling the first part of his mission. Flames that had begun to lick the hulls of Greek vessels were extinguished as the defenders surged forward. But the momentum of battle is a dangerous thing. The more the Trojans fled, the more Patroclus felt the urge to pursue them. Hector, seeing his men driven back, rallied his captains. He ordered a stand at the gates of Troy, but the retreat was too swift, too chaotic. Patroclus pressed on, striking down Sarpedon, the son of Zeus, in a duel that would be remembered for generations. The death of Sarpedon sent shockwaves through both armies. Some fought harder in vengeance, others faltered at the loss of such a figure. The killing of a prince drew the attention of the gods. Zeus himself, watching from Olympus, weighed his decision. He could save his son from death, but Hera and the threads of fate stayed his hand. The war, after all, was shaped by forces even he would not undo. As the fighting spread toward the Scamander River, Patroclus found himself far beyond the limits Achilles had set. The armor felt lighter now, as though it were urging him onward. The Myrmidons followed, cutting down any Trojan who turned to fight. Patroclus' heart pounded, not only from the exertion of battle but from the intoxicating rush of victory. Yet every step deeper into Trojan territory was a step closer to danger. Apollo, protector of Troy, had watched long enough. The god descended unseen into the chaos, determined to halt the man wearing Achilles' armor. A sudden force struck Patroclus from behind, dazing him and knocking his helmet to the ground. The plume that had inspired fear now lay in the dust, and with it, the illusion that Achilles himself was present. Patroclus staggered, his vision blurring, but still he fought. He struck down another foe, only to feel the sharp bite of a spear in his side. Euphorbus, a young Trojan warrior, had seized the chance, wounding him but not yet felling him. Patroclus turned to face his attacker, but the shadow of Hector now loomed over him. Hector stood before Patroclus, his spear ready, his eyes blazing with the determination of a man defending his home and honor. The battlefield around them churned with dust and blood, but for a moment the noise seemed distant. The two warriors measured each other, one believing he faced Achilles himself, the other weakened by wounds yet unwilling to yield. "You have come far enough, son of Peleus," Hector called out, assuming the man in front of him was Achilles. His voice carried over the clash of arms. "This is Troy's day, not yours. You will not breach our walls." Patroclus, catching his breath, answered through clenched teeth. "Hector, today you will see that the strength of the Achaeans cannot be broken. The ships will not burn, and your people will not find victory here." Before more could be said, Hector's spear came forward in a sudden thrust. Patroclus raised his shield, feeling the jolt of impact run down his arm. He countered with his own spear, striking Hector's shield and forcing him back a step. The duel began in earnest, swift blows, circling footwork, the bright flash of bronze in the sun. But Patroclus was fighting on borrowed time. The wound from Euphorbus stung with every movement, and Apollo's unseen strike still left him unsteady. Hector, sensing weakness, pressed the attack. Twice Patroclus parried, but the third blow drove him back against the press of battling soldiers. In that instant Apollo struck again, this time openly. The god's invisible hand smote Patroclus from behind, knocking the breath from his lungs and filling his limbs with sudden heaviness. The spear slipped from his fingers. Hector seized the moment, driving his weapon into Patroclus' belly. The point tore through armor and flesh, sending a hot wave of pain coursing through him. The Myrmidons, seeing their leader struck, roared in fury, but the crush of Trojan warriors kept them from reaching him in time. Patroclus staggered, blood soaking the armor of Achilles. He fell to one knee and Hector approached, lifting his spear for the final blow. Before striking, Hector pulled back the helmet and saw not Achilles, but another face, a face he recognized. "Patroclus," he said almost in surprise. "It was you all along." Patroclus, his voice weak but steady, replied, "Yes, it was I. And though you kill me today, know this, Hector, you will not live to see another sunrise after Achilles hears of my death. He will come for you and Troy will mourn." Hector's eyes hardened. "Perhaps. But I will face him when the time comes." With that he drove his spear home. Patroclus collapsed onto the dust of the battlefield, the light fading from his eyes. For a moment time seemed to slow. The Myrmidons cried out in anguish, their voices carrying across the plain. Hector bent and stripped the armor from Patroclus' body, Achilles' armor, a prize greater than gold or bronze. He handed it to his men to carry back to the city, intending to wear it himself as a symbol of victory. Euphorbus stood nearby, proud of his earlier strike, but Hector claimed the glory of the kill. "Go back to your family, boy," Hector told him curtly. "You have done your part. This man will be remembered as my prize." The Trojans rallied around Hector, their spirits lifted by the fall of one they thought was Achilles. They pushed forward again, driving the Greeks back step by step. But the Myrmidons, enraged, fought with renewed ferocity, their goal no longer to win the day, but to recover the body of their fallen commander. A fierce struggle broke out over Patroclus' corpse. Men fell on both sides, their blood darkening the ground. The Myrmidons formed a shield wall around the body, refusing to let it be taken. Antilochus, a swift-footed Greek warrior, saw what had happened and knew at once that Achilles must be told. He broke away from the fight, sprinting toward the rear lines. Meanwhile, Automedon, Achilles' charioteer, fought desperately to keep the immortal horses from bolting. The steeds of Peleus sensed their master's absence and the death of the one who had worn his armor. They reared and stamped, their manes tossing, refusing to move forward or back. Automedon shouted to them, trying to steady their hearts. Back in the camp, Achilles sat apart as he had for days. But when Antilochus burst into the tent, pale-faced and breathless, Achilles knew something was wrong before a word was spoken. "Achilles," Antilochus began, his voice choked with grief, "Patroclus is fallen. Hector has slain him and taken your armor." The words cut through Achilles like a blade. For a moment he did not move. Then a low, terrible sound rose from his chest, a cry that shook the air. He tore at his hair, covered his face with his hands, and let his voice carry across the sea, calling to his mother, the sea goddess Thetis. In the camp, men stopped what they were doing to listen. Some had never heard such a sound from Achilles before, a mix of anguish, rage, and despair. Thetis, far beneath the waves, heard her son's cry and rose from the depths, bringing with her the daughters of the sea. When she reached him, she knelt beside him. "My child, why do you weep?" she asked, though she already knew. "Patroclus is dead," Achilles answered, his voice shaking. "Hector has taken my armor. I swore I would not fight, but now I must. I will kill Hector with my own hands, though I know it will seal my own fate. Thetis's heart ached. She knew the prophecy well, that Achilles would live a long but unremarkable life if he stayed from battle, or a short but glorious one if he returned. If you go back to war, she said softly, you will not return alive. Achilles met her gaze. Then so be it. I cannot live while Hector walks free after killing Patroclus. I will avenge him. Thetis rose and placed her hand on his shoulder. If you are to fight, you will need new armor. Wait here. I will go to Hephaestus, the god of the forge, and ask him to make you weapons greater than any on earth. She vanished into the sea, leaving Achilles with his grief. In the meantime, the battle over Patroclus' body raged on. Ajax the Greater, a towering figure among the Greeks, joined the Myrmidons in their defense. His shield was like a moving wall, his spear striking down anyone who came too close. Beside him fought Menelaus, brother of Agamemnon, determined to keep Patroclus from being dishonored. The Trojans, led by Hector, pressed hard. 3 times they drove the Greeks back, and 3 times Ajax rallied them to stand firm. The body of Patroclus lay at the center of this desperate struggle, each side knowing that possession of it meant more than a tactical gain, it was a matter of honor. Amid the chaos, Hector donned the armor he had taken from Patroclus. The fit was not perfect, for it had been crafted for Achilles, but it gave him a fearsome appearance. His men cheered at the sight, believing it an omen of Troy's triumph. But some among the Trojans felt uneasy, for they knew the armor belonged to the greatest warrior of the Greeks, and wearing it might draw the wrath of the gods. Far from the fighting, Thetis reached the forge of Hephaestus. The god welcomed her kindly, for she had once sheltered him when he was cast from Olympus. She told him of Patroclus' death, of Achilles' grief, and of the need for new armor. Hephaestus agreed at once, setting to work with skill unmatched by mortal hands. Bronze, gold, and silver took shape under his hammer, the ringing sound echoing across the halls of his workshop. As the god labored, the battle for Patroclus' body continued without pause. Blood soaked the earth, the cries of the wounded and dying mingling with the clash of weapons. Both Greeks and Trojans knew that this day would be remembered for generations, not for the ground gained or lost, but for the death of a man whose courage had changed the course of the war. The battlefield was a haze of heat, dust, and the metallic scent of blood. The bronze greaves on Patroclus' legs felt heavier now, as if the weight of fate itself pressed down on him. Achilles' armor gleamed even under the fading sun, catching the eyes of friend and foe alike, and for a moment, the Myrmidons fought with renewed fury. They believed their commander had returned. They believed victory was at hand. But the illusion could not last forever. Already, murmurs spread among the Trojan ranks. This is not Achilles. A trained warrior's I could see it in the stance, in the way the spear was held, in the subtle hesitations. Hector, son of Priam, knew this in his heart. Standing tall near the Scaean gate, he watched as Patroclus carved through the Trojan lines, pushing them back toward the city walls. Hector's lips tightened into a grim line. This one is bold, he muttered, but boldness without wisdom is the shortest path to Hades. Patroclus, however, had no thought of caution. The rush of battle had consumed him. Again and again he drove the Trojans backward, killing Sarpedon, prince of Lycia, in a duel that left the earth dark with spilled blood. Sarpedon's fall shook both armies. He was a son of Zeus himself, and the king of the gods looked down from Olympus, his brows furrowed in grief. Will you not avenge him? Hera's voice was sharp in Zeus's ear. But Zeus could only sigh. Fate has claimed him as it will claim all men. Even my own son is not beyond the thread spun by the fates. Yet Zeus's sorrow for Sarpedon turned quickly to concern for Patroclus. He knew the mortal's doom was near. Still the Myrmidon pressed forward. He reached the very gates of Troy, close enough to see the carvings upon the wooden doors. The city loomed before him, its walls towering into the evening sky. The Trojans were in disarray, their warriors falling back inside. At that moment, Patroclus could have pulled away. He could have remembered Achilles' warning, drive them from the ships but do not go to the walls of Troy. But pride and victory's scent drowned out his friend's voice. He was Achilles now, or so he told himself, and Achilles would not stop here. He lifted his spear high, calling to his men to follow. The Myrmidons roared in answer, and the Trojans, seeing the advance, rallied in desperation. Apollo, watching from the heights of Pergamus, the sacred part of the city, had seen enough. The god of the silver bow favored the Trojans and could not allow this false Achilles to breach their gates. In a flash of light, Apollo descended to the wall, his presence unseen by mortal eyes but felt in the sudden chill that swept the air. Patroclus felt a strange resistance in his chest as he charged. His spear blow missed its mark, glancing off Hector's shield instead of piercing it. A second attempt was interrupted by a blinding light, and he stumbled, his balance breaking for the first time all day. He blinked hard, but the glare seemed to cling to his eyes. "You will not take this city, Patroclus?" a voice whispered in his mind, deep and commanding. He spun, but saw only shadows moving along the edge of his vision. Then came the first blow, an invisible strike from Apollo's hand to his back. It was not enough to kill, but enough to stagger him, enough to loosen the strength in his limbs. His shield arm dropped slightly, his breath hitching. Euphorbus, a young Trojan warrior eager for glory, saw his chance. Sprinting forward, he thrust his spear into Patroclus' side, the point scraping along the armor but biting into flesh where the bronze plates parted. The pain was sharp and sudden, and Patroclus staggered back, swinging his spear wildly to drive Euphorbus away. The wound was not mortal, but the damage was done. Blood began to seep beneath the greaves, his movements slowing. Apollo struck again, unseen, sending the helmet flying from Patroclus' head. It hit the ground and rolled, the crested plume falling into the dust. The sight shocked the Myrmidons. Achilles' helmet should never touch the earth. Hector saw the moment for what it was. He surged forward, shouting to his men, "Now! This is no son of Peleus." He leveled his spear, his steps quick and sure, closing the distance between them. Patroclus turned to face him, his vision swimming. The two met in the shadow of Troy's walls, their spears clashing with a ring that echoed off the stone. Patroclus managed one last lunge, grazing Hector's shoulder, but his strength was fading fast. The Trojan prince pressed his advantage, slamming his shield into Patroclus' chest. "You thought to take our city?" Hector's voice was like iron. "You thought to wear another man's glory?" With a final thrust, Hector drove his spear deep into Patroclus' belly. The force lifted him from his feet, and when Hector pulled the weapon free, the Myrmidon fell to his knees. As the dust swirled around them, Patroclus' eyes cleared for a moment. He looked not at Hector but far beyond, as though seeing Achilles in his mind's eye. His voice was hoarse but steady. "It was not you, Hector, who killed me. It was Apollo, and destiny. And soon, your own death will come at the hands of the man whose armor I wear." Hector frowned, unsettled by the prophecy, but he would not show fear before his men. With a swift motion, he stepped back as Patroclus toppled to the ground, his life leaving him in a long exhale. The Myrmidons cried out in anguish, their formation faltering. Hector wasted no time. He stripped Achilles' armor from the body, lifting the gleaming bronze for all to see. "Behold," he called to the Trojans, "the armor of Achilles is ours, and so shall be the day." The Trojans roared, their courage renewed. Far away in the Greek camp, word of Patroclus' fall had not yet reached Achilles. But a strange heaviness filled the air, and even the sea seemed to hush as though waiting for the storm to come. As night crept over the plain, the battle raged on around Patroclus' body. The Greeks fought desperately to recover it, knowing the honor of their comrade must be preserved, while the Trojans fought to hold their prize. Spears clashed, arrows whistled through the dark, and the stars above watched in silence. Somewhere beyond mortal sight, the fates measured the thread of Hector's life, and the shears hovered close. For in killing Patroclus, Hector had sealed not only his enemy's doom but his own. And far across the sea, Thetis, mother of Achilles, felt the shift in the world. She knew her son's grief would soon turn to wrath, and that wrath would consume Troy's greatest champion. The plain of Troy lay littered with the fallen, the dust settling over them like a shroud. Patroclus' body lay still, yet in death he had set in motion the turning of the war. The borrowed armor was gone, but the debt it had created would be repaid in blood. The night was not silent for long. Somewhere in the Greek camp, a voice would soon rise in a cry that would shake the very walls of Troy, a cry for vengeance, for friendship lost, and for the wrath of Achilles to come. The Greek camp lay under a dark, heavy sky. A chill came with the night wind, carrying with it the smell of blood and smoke from the day's battle. The warriors moved with slow, weary steps, their eyes turned toward the plain where the fight had ebbed but not ended. In the center of the camp, men gathered in tight knots, speaking in low voices. All knew the truth, though few dared to speak it aloud. Patroclus was dead. In his tent, Achilles sat apart, unaware of the final blow. He had refused to fight for weeks, his anger toward Agamemnon burning hotter than any rage for Troy. But that anger was nothing compared to the grief that now came to claim him. The first to enter was Antilochus, his face pale with dust and sorrow. The young warrior knelt, his voice shaking. "Son of Peleus," he began, "I bring news you would not wish to hear. Patroclus has fallen. Hector struck him down near the walls of Troy. The Trojans hold his body still." For a moment there was silence, deep, suffocating silence. Achilles did not blink. His hands, resting on his knees, curled into fists so tight the knuckles whitened. Then he rose slowly as though every muscle strained to contain what burned inside him. The cry that tore from his throat was like no sound of mortal origin. It was a roar, a wail, a command to heaven itself. It rolled over the camp, freezing men in their steps. Horses reared and strained at their tethers. Even on the walls of Troy, far across the plain, men turned in fear, for the sound reached them as if carried on a divine wind. Thetis, deep beneath the sea in her coral halls, heard it as well. The mother's heart within her clenched. She rose through the waters, cutting through the waves until she broke the surface near the shore. There she found her son standing like a figure carved from stone, his face pale but his eyes alight with something terrible. "Mother," Achilles said, his voice low but sharp as a blade, "Patroclus is dead. Hector wears my armor. I must return to the fight." Thetis touched his shoulder, feeling the tremor in him. "If you go back, my child, you will have your vengeance, but you will not return from Troy alive. The fates have spun it so. Your choice is to live long without glory or die young, your name eternal." Achilles did not hesitate. "Let it be short. I would rather my name be remembered for all ages than live a long life in obscurity. Patroclus must be avenged." Thetis saw there was no turning him. "Then you will need armor again, for Hector has taken yours. Wait, and I shall bring you that which no mortal hand can make." With that she returned to the sea, seeking Hephaestus, the god of the forge. The forge of the gods. Far in the depths of Olympus, the forge of Hephaestus rang with the sound of hammers on bronze. Sparks leapt into the dark as the god of fire worked his craft. Thetis approached him, her plea already in her eyes. "Hephaestus," she said, "my son has lost his armor. I beg you, make him one worthy of his vengeance." The smith god nodded, for he had heard of Patroclus' fall. "For the greatest of warriors, I will make the greatest of arms." Through the night he labored. He shaped a shield vast and round, its surface alive with scenes of the world itself, cities at peace, armies in battle, the lands and seas, the constellations above. The breastplate shone with the glow of polished bronze, edged with gold. Greaves of silver fit for a king, and a helmet crowned with a crest of pure horsehair that shimmered like fire. When Thetis returned at dawn, the armor lay ready, shining as though it had been born from the heart of the sun. She took it to her son, and when Achilles set the pieces upon himself, the light of it seemed almost too bright for mortal eyes. The reconciliation. Before the first spear could be thrown that day, Achilles went to find Agamemnon. The quarrel that had kept him from battle now seemed small beside the death of his friend. In the assembly of kings he spoke plainly. "I have no more anger for you, son of Atreus. Let us end our strife. Give me your hand, so we may fight as one again." Agamemnon, chastened by the losses the Greeks had suffered, clasped Achilles' hand. "It was folly that kept us apart. Let us drive the Trojans back together." Thus, the rift between the two greatest leaders of the Greek host was healed in the shadow of Patroclus' death. The call to arms. When the sun rose high, the Myrmidons gathered before Achilles' tent. They looked upon their commander, clad now in the god-forged armor, and their spirits lifted as if touched by Olympus itself. Achilles' voice rang out over them. "Today we fight not for Agamemnon, not for kings or spoils, but for Patroclus. We will take him from the Trojans, and Hector will fall before the sun sets." The Greek army moved out in force, the earth trembling beneath the march of thousands. The Trojans, seeing Achilles at their head, felt their courage falter. This was no false warrior in borrowed armor. This was the son of Peleus, the scourge of Troy, and his wrath was a thing beyond mortal measure. The first clash. The plain erupted in violence as the two armies met. Achilles was a storm-given form, his spear flashing in the sun as he cut through Trojan lines. No man could stand before him. Those who tried fell within moments, their shields splintered, their lifeblood staining the ground. He sought Hector, but the Trojan prince held back, rallying his men from a distance. The lesser warriors bore the weight of Achilles' fury, and they broke like waves against a cliff. Each time a Trojan fell, Achilles moved on without pause, as though driven by a force greater than his own will. His mind saw only two things: Patroclus lying dead and Hector standing over him. All else was a blur of bronze and blood. The river runs red. The slaughter drove the Trojans back toward the river's commander. Those who reached its banks hoped for safety in the crossing, but Achilles waded in after them, the water swirling dark around his knees. Spears clashed in the shallows, shields went under, and bodies floated downstream. The river god himself rose from the depths, angered by the carnage. "Son of Peleus, you defile my waters with the dead. Leave my banks or I will sweep you away." But Achilles would not yield. "I will not leave until I have slain them all." Enraged, the river swelled, its current rising to engulf him. Achilles fought the tide as he had fought men, striking at the waves as though they were flesh. Only when the gods themselves intervened, Athena lending him strength, Hera calling upon Hephaestus to send fire, did the river retreat, its fury cooled. The day's end approaches. By the time the sun began to lower, the plain was littered with the dead. The Trojans had been driven back to their very gates, the shadow of their walls falling long across the field. Achilles stood amid the ruin, his armor splashed with blood, his breath steady despite the endless fighting. Hector still waited. The moment of reckoning was near. And as the last light of day began to fade, the two would meet, and the fate of Troy would take another irreversible turn. The battlefield stretched before Achilles like a living wound upon the earth. The morning sun glinted on blood-slick armor, and the cries of the dying mingled with the metallic crash of weapons. He stood at the forefront, bronze greaves splattered with the dust and gore of the day before, his eyes scanning the Trojan ranks for the face he sought above all others, Hector. The name burned in his chest like a brand, the image of Patroclus lying lifeless still fresh and unshakable. Achilles moved forward without waiting for his Myrmidons to form ranks. His presence alone seemed to cut a path through the press of fighting, not because the Trojans feared just one man, but because they knew which man approached. The son of Peleus had returned, and his rage was now unchained from all restraint. The Trojans felt it like a pressure in the air, an invisible hand clutching their throats. The first man to challenge him was Aeneas, son of Aphrodite, armored in gleaming bronze that had seen many battles. Aeneas planted his feet, raising his shield, but Achilles did not slow. His spear, forged by the god Hephaestus himself, flashed in his grip. In a single, fluid motion he hurled it. The weapon sang as it flew, the air parting in fear, and it struck Aeneas' shield with such force that the Trojan was driven to his knees. Only by divine intervention did he live, for Poseidon, god of the sea, snatched Aeneas away in a swirl of mist before Achilles could deliver the killing blow. A roar of frustration burst from Achilles' throat, and he turned that fury upon the men nearest to him. Spear and sword worked in a seamless dance. Every thrust found a gap in armor, every stroke split shield or skull. His movements were not frantic but measured, each kill executed with precision that betrayed his mastery. He left a trail of bodies in his wake, a grim line marking the path of his wrath. Men tried to flee before him, but the press of their own retreating ranks trapped them. Chariots overturned as drivers panicked, horses screamed and reared, and the ground became slick underfoot. Achilles pressed forward relentlessly. His Myrmidons, now swept into the charge, followed in a tight wedge cutting deeper into Trojan lines. They shouted his name as they fought, but Achilles barely heard them. His focus was narrow, his purpose unshakable. The river Scamander lay ahead, its waters glinting under the sun, and the Trojans, desperate to escape, hurled themselves into it. Armor dragged them down, and many never resurfaced. Achilles reached the bank, his spear in hand, and began cutting down those who scrambled onto the shore. He showed no mercy, striking down even men who dropped their weapons and begged for quarter. The sight drew the attention of the river god himself. The waters began to churn, swelling higher, and a voice like the roar of a flood filled the air. "Achilles, you defile my banks with the bodies of the slain. You choke my currents with their blood. Cease your slaughter or face the wrath of the river." But Achilles, his chest heaving, answered with scorn. "I will not stop until the Trojans are broken, until Hector lies dead before me. Let the river fight if it dares." At that, Scamander rose against him. A wall of water surged forward, sweeping men and corpses alike into its depths. Achilles was thrown from his feet, his armor dragging him down, but he fought to stand, leaping toward higher ground. Yet the river pursued him, curling like a living serpent around his legs, trying to drag him back into the current. He hacked at the water with his sword, a futile gesture, until the gods themselves intervened. Hera, queen of Olympus, sent Hephaestus to aid him, and the god of fire unleashed blazing heat upon the river's edge. Steam rose in choking clouds, and Scamander, scorched and raging, retreated. Achilles stood soaked and panting on the bank, his grip tight on his spear, the heat from Hephaestus' flames warming the chill left by the water. The clash of mortal and divine faded for a moment, and Achilles pressed forward once more. The Trojans had regrouped near the gates of their city, trying to mount a defense before the walls. Apollo himself, protector of Troy, now walked among them in disguise, lending courage where fear had taken hold. But even the god's presence could not erase the memory of Achilles' slaughter by the river. A chariot drew up before him, driven by Automedon with 2 swift horses, Xanthos and Balios, gifts from the gods. Achilles mounted, his eyes scanning the plain, and pointed toward the Trojan lines. "Drive me forward," he commanded, "and do not hold the reins for fear of their spears. I will strike them down before they can draw breath." The chariot surged ahead, wheels cutting deep grooves into the earth, scattering dirt and gore alike. Achilles hurled his spear into the first rank, piercing a man clean through and striking another behind him. Drawing a sword from his side, he leapt from the chariot into the melee, fighting with the ferocity of a storm-made flesh. His mind was not on the lives he ended, nor on the cries that rose around him. Every motion, every step, every kill brought him closer to the moment he sought, the clash with Hector. The image of his friend's body, stripped of armor and defiled by the enemy, drove him beyond mortal endurance. Among the Trojans, panic began to spread like fire through dry grass. Men shouted conflicting orders, some calling for retreat to the gates, others demanding they stand and fight. The confusion only made them easier prey for the Myrmidons and the Greek warriors emboldened by Achilles' return. At last he caught sight of Hector in the distance, standing at the head of the Trojan defense. The prince's armor gleamed, his spear ready, but even from afar, Achilles could see the weight in Hector's stance. They were destined to meet, both knew it, yet the gods had not yet allowed the moment. Other battles still needed to be fought, other warriors yet to be slain. So Achilles continued his grim work. He cut down the sons of noble houses, scattering the hopes of Troy with each thrust of his spear. No prayer was answered, no mercy granted. He was the storm that would not pass, the fire that would not die. The sun climbed high, burning down upon the plain, and still Achilles fought. His armor, bright at dawn, was now streaked with blood and dirt, dented where blows had landed but never pierced. His breath came hard, but his strikes lost none of their speed or strength. By the time the Trojan lines broke again and fell back toward the gates, the plain was littered with the dead. Achilles stood among them, his chest rising and falling, his shadow long in the afternoon sun. He looked once more toward the walls of Troy, and the figure of Hector still waiting there. The day's work was not yet done. The walls of Troy loomed high, their massive stones casting long shadows across the plain. The gates, carved with the symbols of their city's long endurance, stood partly open to allow fleeing warriors inside. Dust rose in choking clouds as men and chariots poured through. But in the midst of this retreat, one man did not move, Hector, prince of Troy, champion of its people. He stood at the Scaean gate, spear in hand, helm glinting, his figure a solitary defiance against the tide of fear. Around him, old men begged him to retreat within the walls. Women, their voices cracking, called his name from the battlements. Yet Hector's eyes were fixed far across the plain, where a lone figure in god-forged armor strode forward with a pace that admitted no hesitation. Achilles. The son of Peleus had cut through half the Trojan army to reach this moment. The blood of princes and common men alike stained his hands, but their deaths were only the prelude to this encounter. All his fury, all his grief, all his thirst for vengeance had crystallized into the sight before him. Hector standing at Troy's gate, the slayer of Patroclus, the man who had stripped his friend's body of armor. Achilles slowed his steps, his eyes locked on his enemy. Around them, the noise of battle seemed to fade, the clashing of bronze and cries of the dying falling into a strange silence. Even the wind held still. Hector's resolve, though strong, trembled as Achilles drew nearer. He felt the weight of the moment pressing against him, the knowledge that this fight was not simply between two men, but between two fates. His knees wanted to turn him toward the safety of the gates, but pride anchored his feet. To run would be to doom his name, to mark him forever as a coward in the songs yet to be sung. Yet when Achilles came within striking distance, Hector's nerve broke. Instinct seized him and he turned, running along the walls of Troy. Gasps rose from the battlements as their champion fled, but no jeers followed, only silence heavy with disbelief. Achilles gave chase without a word, his speed unnatural, his armor flashing in the sunlight. 3 times they circled the city, their footsteps kicking up the dust of countless sieges past. The gods themselves looked down, watching in fascination. Zeus, ruler of Olympus, weighed their fates upon his golden scales, and the balance tipped. Hector's death was sealed. It was then that Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, intervened. Disguising herself as Deiphobos, Hector's brother, she appeared before him on the circuit of their run. "Brother," she called, "let us face him together. We cannot outrun him forever." Believing the ruse, Hector stopped and turned to face Achilles. His breath came in harsh gulps, his arms ached from the chase, but his pride flared anew. He leveled his spear. "I will not flee again. Let us meet in single combat, and the gods decide our victor." Achilles halted, his own breath steady despite the run. "No pacts between us, Hector. No oaths. You robbed me of my friend's life, and I will have yours in return." The two warriors began to circle one another, each searching for an opening. Hector struck first, hurling his spear with all the strength left in his arms. The shaft sped true, but Achilles turned it aside with the shield crafted by Hephaestus. In a heartbeat, Achilles countered, launching his own spear. It missed, striking the earth behind Hector, but before the Trojan could seize the moment, Athena was at Achilles' side, returning the weapon unseen by Hector's eyes. Hector, thinking he still had an ally at his back, called for another spear, but none came. He turned his head slightly in confusion, and in that instant, Achilles struck. His spear flashed like lightning, finding the small gap at Hector's neck where the armor joined. The bronze tip punched through flesh, and Hector staggered, the life flooding from him even as he struggled to remain upright. "Do not let the dogs devour me," Hector gasped, his voice thick with blood. "Return my body to my family, that Troy may honor me." Achilles' face was as unyielding as the shield upon his arm. "There will be no mercy for you, Hector. Patroclus lies unburied because of you. Your body will feed the beasts, and your name will taste of dust in the mouths of your kin." With a final twist, Achilles tore the spear free, and Hector collapsed upon the earth. The cries from Troy's walls rose like a great wave, women wailing, men shouting in grief and rage. And yet Achilles did not look up. He bent to strip Hector's armor, the same armor that had once belonged to Patroclus, armor that had been forged for Achilles himself before it passed through so many hands. Then came the act that would sear his name into both glory and infamy. He pierced the tendons of Hector's ankles, threading them with rawhide thongs, and tied them to the back of his chariot. Mounting beside Automedon, Achilles urged his horses forward. The body of Hector, prince of Troy, champion of his people, was dragged across the plain, dust and blood marking the path back toward the Greek camp. The sight drove the Trojans on the walls to madness. Priam, the aged king, tore his robes and flung himself into the dust, crying for his son. Hecuba, mother of many, raised her hands to the sky and cursed the gods for their cruelty. And yet none could act, for the Greeks now held the plain, and Achilles was a figure none dared challenge. The Greek camp erupted in a different sound, shouts of triumph, the clash of spears on shields. Warriors swarmed to see the body of Hector, to lay eyes upon the proof that Troy's greatest defender was no more. Achilles, however, felt no joy. The kill had not cooled the fire in his chest. The shadow of Patroclus still stood behind his eyes. Night fell over the plain, but the darkness brought no peace. Achilles had Hector's body laid beside the bier of Patroclus, as though the dead could see each other in the gloom of the underworld. He swore aloud that he would not bury Hector until he had offered Patroclus every prize taken from the Trojans, until the funeral pyre burned high enough to please his friend's spirit. The next day the funeral rites began. A great pyre was built for Patroclus, towering and wide, its wood stacked with care. Offerings of oil, honey, and wine were poured upon it, and the bodies of Trojan captives, slain as sacrifice, were laid among the timbers. Horses, their manes shorn, were led forward and struck down, their bodies arranged beside the pyre. Achilles' own hair, long and golden, he cut and placed in Patroclus' hands, a final gift to the man who had shared his boyhood and his battles. When the flames roared high, Achilles stood before them, his face lit by the fire. The heat stung his eyes, but he did not look away. Only when the pyre had burned to ash did he order the remains gathered, placed within a golden urn, and buried beneath a mound. The Myrmidons stood silent as the earth was heaped, the wind carrying the smell of charred wood and bone. But even as grief was given its due, Achilles' wrath had not ebbed. For 12 days he kept Hector's body by his tent, dragging it each morning behind his chariot around Patroclus' tomb. And yet, by the will of the gods, the flesh did not decay, nor did the wounds grow worse, for Apollo shielded the fallen prince from true defilement. On the 12th day something happened that even Achilles had not expected. An old man, frail but unbroken, entered the Greek camp at night, guided by the god Hermes. Priam, king of Troy, had come alone, bringing rich ransom for his son's body. He knelt before Achilles, clasping the hands that had slain Hector, and spoke in a voice heavy with both courage and sorrow. "Remember your own father, Achilles. He too is old, and he too will never see you return from this war. I have endured what no man should, to kiss the hands of the man who killed my son." The words struck Achilles deeper than any spear could. For a moment he saw not Priam but Peleus, his own father, aged and waiting in Phthia, perhaps even now fearing the news of his son's death. His anger faltered, and in its place came something quieter, understanding and the weight of what he had done. Gently Achilles helped Priam to his feet. He promised a truce for the time it would take to bury Hector, and he ordered the body returned, cleansed and clothed in fine robes. At dawn the Trojans carried their prince through the gates, and the city's mourning filled the air. For 9 days they prepared the funeral, and on the 10th they burned Hector's body, his ashes placed in a golden urn and buried beneath a mound as his people wept. And so ended the duel that had been watched by gods and men alike, a battle that was both the height of Achilles' glory and the moment when the shadow of his own fate drew nearer. For Achilles knew, as all who heard the songs knew, that his time was now short. The prophecy had always been clear. After Hector's death, Achilles' own would swiftly follow. The walls of Troy loomed under the harsh midday sun, their shadows stretching across the dusty streets where the air hung heavy with the anticipation of war. For years, the city had stood defiant against the might of the Achaean army, a bulwark of stone and courage against the relentless tide of Greek heroes and their relentless siege. Within its gates, life had grown tense and somber, the usual bustle of markets and courtyards replaced by anxious whispers and hurried preparations. Every face bore the strain of prolonged conflict. Parents clutched their children close, warriors polished their armor with meticulous care, and the elders of the city prayed to the gods for mercy. Hector, son of Priam and Hecuba, moved among his people with a grave purpose. The weight of Troy rested upon his broad shoulders, and he bore it as both a duty and a burden. From the moment he had first grasped the sword of his forefathers, Hector had been trained not only as a warrior but as a protector, a symbol of hope to a city besieged by despair. His every decision was a balance between courage and caution, his every action a testament to the life he had sworn to defend. Today, however, the tension in his chest was unlike any he had felt before. A storm brewed on the horizon, not of weather but of fate, and Hector, with his heart heavy yet steady, sensed that the end of Troy's long struggle was drawing near. The Achaean forces had encamped on the plains beyond the Scaean gate, their banners snapping in the wind like the cries of destiny. Among them, Achilles, the mightiest of Greek warriors, prepared himself with the same meticulous care Hector had observed in his own ranks. The son of Peleus moved with a lethal precision, his mind sharpened by years of bloodshed and rage, his armor glinting like a herald of doom. News of Achilles' anger had reached Troy weeks before, carried on the wings of scouts and deserters, and it had struck a chord of unease even in the hearts of men as brave as Hector. Yet despite the shadow of fear, Hector refused to yield. To retreat or hide would be to abandon his city, his family, and the legacy of his forebears. His place was here, on the front lines, where the fate of Troy and its people would be decided. The morning sun climbed higher as Hector convened with the city's commanders, men of courage and experience who had long defended the gates and walls. Strategies were discussed, maps spread across tables, and voices rose in heated debate over tactics and contingencies. Hector listened patiently, weighing each argument, his mind a machine of careful calculation. His duty was to ensure that every man, every soldier, every shield-bearer, would have a chance to survive the day, even as he understood that survival was no longer guaranteed. He could feel the eyes of Troy upon him, the silent hope that their champion would not falter when the ultimate test arrived. When the meeting ended, Hector moved to the walls to survey the enemy lines. The Greeks had erected their encampment in disciplined rows, their armor and spears forming a nearly impenetrable line of steel and resolve. Horses pawed the ground, and the clatter of arms echoed across the plains. Archers and slingers moved with purposeful precision, their shadows flickering on the stone as if to warn the city of the approaching storm. Hector's gaze traveled to the figure of Achilles, who strode across the camp like a living shadow of death, his armor catching the sunlight in a blaze that seemed almost divine. Every instinct within Hector told him that this day would test not only the strength of his body but the resilience of his spirit. He returned to the palace briefly, where Priam, the aged king of Troy, awaited him. The king's eyes, clouded with the weight of years and sorrow, reflected the fear that no crown could shield against. Priam's hands trembled slightly as he clasped his son's arm, a gesture of both love and desperation. "Hector," he said, his voice roughened by grief and fatigue, "the city depends on you, but know that my heart trembles for your fate. The Greeks have suffered much, yet they have not given up. You carry more than your own life into the field today." Hector nodded, his jaw firm, yet he allowed a shadow of tenderness to pass through his stern expression. "Father, I carry Troy with me," he replied, "and I will not falter. Whatever comes, I face it knowing that I have done all I can for our people." Priam's lips pressed together, a quiet acknowledgement of the inevitable, as though even he understood that fate, the invisible hand of the gods, had already set the pieces in motion. Beyond the walls, the city streets hummed with preparation. Women and children gathered food and water, stockpiling provisions for those who would be forced to retreat to the safety of inner strongholds should the battle turn against them. Blacksmiths worked tirelessly, repairing weapons and reinforcing armor, each clang of hammer against metal a solemn drumbeat to the rhythm of impending war. Priests and priestesses moved through the crowd, chanting prayers to Apollo, Athena, and Zeus, their voices rising in harmony with the anxious murmurs of the citizens. Every moment was saturated with tension, every glance a silent prayer for mercy. Hector understood these fears. They were as real to him as the spear in his hand or the shield on his arm. Yet the thought of succumbing to them never crossed his mind. He had trained his entire life for this confrontation, and he would meet it head-on whatever the cost. When the time came, Hector donned his armor, the bronze plates gleaming under the sun's harsh glare. Each strap was fastened with precision, each piece of protection checked twice, as if in these small details he could stave off the inexorable tide of destiny. His helmet, adorned with the crest of a proud horse, was lowered over his brow, and he took up his spear, the weight of it comforting in its familiarity. Around him, the men of Troy assembled, forming ranks beneath the walls, their expressions a mix of determination and dread. Hector raised his voice, calling them to remember the honor and glory of Troy, to fight for family, city, and the gods themselves. His words carried across the stone streets, filling the hearts of his soldiers with courage, even as the shadow of Achilles loomed closer on the battlefield. The first clash of spears and shields resounded like thunder across the plains. Arrows arced through the sky, their sharp points seeking flesh and armor alike, and the cries of warriors rose in a cacophony of agony and resolve. Hector led his men with the precision of a seasoned general, striking decisively, shielding the weak and rallying the weary. Every encounter with the enemy tested his reflexes, his strength, and his resolve. The battlefield was a swirling mass of dust and blood, a chaotic testament to human bravery and desperation. Yet even as the Achaeans pushed forward with relentless energy, Hector held the line, his presence an anchor for the faltering and a warning to the bold. Amidst the clamor, a messenger returned from the Greek lines with news that sent a chill through Hector's veins. Achilles, the near-invincible hero whose wrath had decimated the Trojan forces before, had entered the battlefield. His approach was unrelenting, a whirlwind of armor, fury, and divine favor, striking terror into the hearts of men. Word of his wrath spread quickly, carried on the terrified whispers of soldiers and the strained breaths of commanders. The knowledge that Troy's mightiest defender would soon face this paragon of Greek strength pressed heavily upon Hector, yet he concealed any tremor of doubt behind a mask of resolve. To falter now would be to betray not only his city but the memory of those who had fallen before him, who had given their lives in vain if he allowed fear to rule his heart. Hector knew the confrontation was inevitable. He moved through the ranks of his men, offering encouragement, adjusting positions, and instilling discipline in the midst of chaos. Every moment was critical, every decision weighed with the gravity of life and death. He scanned the horizon, spotting Achilles in the distance, his figure unmistakable even from afar. The son of Peleus advanced like a storm incarnate, his wrath palpable in the air, his eyes fixed with deadly precision on Troy's champion. Hector felt the familiar tightening of his chest, the surge of adrenaline that comes when man confronts destiny, yet he did not waver. This was the moment he had been forged for, and he would meet it as he had met every challenge before, with courage, skill, and unwavering resolve. The city itself seemed to hold its breath. Mothers clutched their children, elders whispered prayers to gods old and new, and warriors steeled themselves for the inevitable clash. Hector, aware of every heartbeat around him, moved forward, his spear poised, his shield ready, his mind calculating, anticipating every move his formidable adversary might make. The ground beneath his feet seemed charged with the tension of countless fates, as though the earth itself recognized the significance of what was to come. He could feel the weight of Troy's hopes pressing upon him, yet he drew strength from it, turning potential despair into a resolute determination that would carry him to the edge of mortal endurance. And so, Hector prepared to face the greatest challenge of his life, knowing that the hours ahead would demand every ounce of his skill, courage, and wisdom. The city waited, the battlefield roared, and the inevitable encounter with Achilles drew closer with every heartbeat. The fate of Troy, the honor of its defenders, and the legacy of generations rested upon the shoulders of a single man, who bore the mantle of his people with dignity, courage, and unflinching resolve. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the plains, Hector tightened his grip on his spear, lifted his shield, and stepped forward into the maelstrom, ready to meet the storm that destiny had summoned. The ground trembled beneath the march of Achilles as he drew closer, a force of wrath and precision that seemed almost superhuman. His armor glinted like a shard of sunlight across the plains, each movement deliberate, each step an echo of inevitable destruction. The soldiers of Troy, though hardened by years of war, faltered at the sight. Many gripped their spears tighter, hearts pounding in anticipation of the clash that could decide the fate of the city. And yet Hector did not flinch. His eyes, steady and unwavering, were fixed on the approaching threat. Every instinct within him screamed caution, but duty and honor held him fast. This was not a moment for hesitation. This was a moment for courage forged in the fire of experience and the weight of responsibility. Hector advanced to meet Achilles, his armor clinking softly with every measured step. His spear was poised, his shield steady, and his mind a whirlwind of strategies and countermoves. Around them, the battlefield had grown chaotic, a mix of clashing steel, anguished cries, and the dust rising from countless feet. Troy's defenders rallied behind their champion, drawing courage from his presence even as fear gnawed at their resolve. Each clash between Hector's men and the Greeks was a dance of life and death, a brutal testament to skill, desperation, and the will to survive. Yet the eyes of all were drawn to the two figures moving inexorably toward each other, the city's greatest defender and the Greeks' most feared warrior. When they finally met, it was like the collision of storms. Spears clashed against shields, the metallic ring of impact ringing across the plains. Hector moved with all the grace and power of a seasoned warrior, his every action calculated to parry, strike, and protect. He sought openings, exploiting the slightest weaknesses in the Greek lines, and for a time Troy's champion held his ground. The battle swirled around them, yet in that moment Hector and Achilles existed in a world apart, each aware that the outcome of this confrontation would shape the destiny of countless lives. The duel intensified, each strike a test of strength, agility, and wit. Hector's spear lashed out in precise arcs, aiming for Achilles' exposed sides, yet the Greek hero countered with the effortless power of a man favored by the gods. Achilles' movements were fluid, almost preternatural, his every dodge and thrust calculated to turn Hector's strength against him. The clash of their weapons created sparks that seemed to mirror the fire burning in their hearts. For each attack Hector launched, Achilles met it with a skill born of rage and experience. The battlefield around them faded into a blur as the duel absorbed the attention of all who watched, the sounds of war reduced to the rhythm of combat between these two champions. Despite his prowess, Hector felt the weight of exhaustion creeping into his limbs. Days of relentless combat, sleepless nights, and the burden of leadership pressed upon him with unrelenting force. Sweat ran down his brow, stinging his eyes, and each breath became a reminder of the mortal limits even the greatest warriors must face. Yet he pressed on, driven by loyalty, honor, and the knowledge that retreat was neither possible nor honorable. Troy looked to him for hope, for strength, for survival, and he would not betray that trust. Every parry, every thrust, every maneuver was a testament to his resolve, a statement that he would meet fate head-on no matter the cost. Achilles too showed no sign of fatigue. His rage, stoked by the death of his close companion Patroclus at the hands of Hector, burned hotter than any earthly fire. Every movement was propelled by grief, anger, and an unyielding desire for vengeance. Where Hector fought for duty and honor, Achilles fought for retribution, and the contrast between them defined the intensity of their encounter. The clash of these forces was more than a mere duel. It was a collision of ideals, motivations, and the inexorable will of men caught in the tides of fate. As the fight continued, Hector sought to exploit a fleeting opportunity, feinting left before swinging his spear to the right. Achilles, anticipating the move, shifted with an almost unnatural speed, deflecting the attack with the flat of his blade. Sparks flew where weapon met weapon, and Hector felt a jolt reverberate through his arm. For a brief moment, the weight of inevitability pressed upon him, the understanding that he faced a force beyond ordinary human capacity. He could not falter, yet he could not ignore the truth. Achilles was no ordinary opponent. Every strike he made carried the promise of death, every parry the threat of injury. Yet still Hector pressed on, embodying the courage that had made him Troy's champion. The citizens of Troy watched from the walls, their hearts in their throats. Mothers clutched children close, warriors prayed silently to gods unseen, and the elders whispered words of encouragement and sorrow. Each moment Hector remained standing was a small victory for the city, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming power, courage could hold sway. Yet every moment also carried the shadow of potential doom, the understanding that one misstep could unravel the fragile thread of hope that bound Troy together. It was then that a critical moment arrived. Hector, recognizing an opening, launched a rapid combination of thrusts, aiming to unbalance Achilles and create an opportunity for a decisive strike. Achilles, anticipating the maneuver, shifted his weight, parrying with precision that left no margin for error. The spear clanged against the Greek's armor, rebounding with a force that sent shivers through Hector's arm. The effort required to maintain control over his weapon and shield was immense, yet Hector's determination never faltered. In that instant, both warriors paused for a heartbeat, each measuring the other, each understanding that the coming moments would define the legacy of their lives. Hector's thoughts flickered to his family, Andromache, his beloved wife, and their young son Astyanax. The memory of their faces, of their love and vulnerability, strengthened his resolve. He fought not only for the city but for the memory of those who could not fight beside him, for the hope that Troy might endure beyond the violence of this day. Yet even as he embraced this resolve, he understood the cruel reality. Fate, shaped by the gods and the inexorable march of destiny, had already begun to weave its threads. No matter how skillful, how brave, or how determined he was, he could not escape the hand of death that loomed over him. The duel reached its climax when Achilles, exploiting the briefest lapse in Hector's guard, struck with overwhelming force. The spear found its mark, piercing Hector's armor and inflicting a wound that seared through muscle and bone. Hector staggered, the impact sending a shockwave through his body, yet he did not fall immediately. Pain coursed through him, sharp and unrelenting, a reminder of human vulnerability in the face of near-divine might. The sight of his champion wounded struck terror into the hearts of Troy's defenders, yet Hector's spirit remained unbroken. He planted his shield firmly, grasped his spear, and faced Achilles with eyes that still burned with determination. Achilles pressed forward, relentless and unyielding, while Hector, though wounded, continued to resist. Every movement required immense effort, each breath a testament to his resilience. Around them, the battlefield seemed suspended, a moment of suspended chaos where the fates of men and city hung in the balance. Hector knew that survival was slipping from his grasp, yet he met the Greek hero with the dignity and courage that had defined him throughout his life. He fought not for glory, not for personal victory, but for the city that looked to him as a symbol of hope. But the inevitable could not be denied. Achilles' wrath, sharpened by grief and fueled by near-divine skill, was unstoppable. Hector felt the fatal moment approach, the knowledge that no human strength could withstand the force bearing down upon him. His final thoughts were of Troy, of his family, and of the city that had entrusted its fate to him. He understood the tragic truth of war. Valor alone could not always protect the innocent, and even the greatest of heroes must one day meet the end that destiny demands. As Achilles' spear struck again, this time with deadly precision, Hector fell to the ground, mortally wounded. The battlefield seemed to pause, as though even the earth recognized the gravity of the moment. Troy's defenders cried out in anguish, some rushing forward to aid their fallen champion, others frozen in disbelief. The Achaeans, witnessing the city's greatest warrior felled, felt a mixture of triumph and awe. Hector's fall was more than a personal defeat. It symbolized a turning point in the siege of Troy, a moment when hope and despair collided in a single devastating instant. Even in his final moments, Hector displayed the dignity and courage that had defined him. He struggled to rise to face Achilles once more, but his strength had failed him. The son of Priam, protector of Troy, lay on the plains, the life slowly ebbing from him, yet his spirit remained unbowed. He had fought with honor, led with wisdom, and stood as the shield of a city that now faced the harsh reality of mortality and war. The life drained from Hector as he lay upon the blood-soaked plains outside Troy. Dust and sweat clung to his armor, his shield resting beside him, scarred and dented from countless blows. The roar of battle continued around him, but for Hector, the world had narrowed to the shadow of death and the lingering thoughts of home. His heart beat faintly beneath the wound Achilles had inflicted, each thump a reminder of mortality, of the inescapable fate that had been closing in ever since he first faced the Greek hero. He thought of Andromache, her gentle smile, the sound of her voice soothing even amidst the chaos of war. He thought of young Astyanax, whose small hands had clutched his own in times of play and whose future now lay uncertain without the protection Hector had promised to provide. Even in his final moments, Hector's mind remained clear. He understood that Troy depended upon him not just as a warrior, but as a symbol of hope, a figure whose courage had sustained the city for years. And yet, he also understood the cruel impartiality of fate. No hero, no matter how valiant, could escape the designs of the gods or the unyielding tide of history. Achilles' wrath had proven too great, and Troy's walls, however formidable, could not shield their greatest champion from the inevitable. Hector's final thoughts were a mixture of sorrow, love, and acceptance, a testament to the depth of character that had earned him the respect of friend and foe alike. Achilles stood over him, his chest heaving, eyes burning with rage and grief. The death of Patroclus, his closest companion, had driven the Greek hero to this singular purpose: vengeance. Every swing, every thrust, every calculated strike had been aimed at the man who had slain Patroclus, and now the object of his wrath lay defeated. Yet even in this victory, Achilles' heart carried a complex weight. He recognized Hector's valor, the honor with which he had fought, and despite the hatred that had propelled him across the battlefield, a shadow of respect lingered for the Trojan warrior who had met him with courage unmatched. The clash of vengeance and admiration, of grief and triumph, created a silence in the midst of chaos, a moment where the intensity of war was distilled into the meeting of two extraordinary men and the fatal consequences of conflict. Hector's fall sent ripples of shock and despair through the ranks of Troy. Soldiers who had looked to him for guidance faltered, their formation breaking as they witnessed the inevitable. Their greatest protector was gone. Mothers clutched children, trying to shield them from the brutal truth. Elders wept openly, their prayers to the gods mingling with cries of lamentation and the anguished calls of soldiers attempting to rally around the fallen hero. The walls themselves seemed to mourn, their formidable stones witnesses to the vulnerability of those who had once defended them. Within the city, the echoes of Hector's courage lingered, yet they were now overshadowed by the harsh reality of loss and the impending threat of Greek conquest. Priam, the aged king, received word of Hector's death in the palace. His hands trembled, his eyes wide with disbelief, and a deep groan escaped his throat. Years of rulership, years of watching sons grow and fall in the shadow of war, culminated in this moment of grief that words could scarcely encompass. He sank to the ground, overcome with sorrow that had no outlet, no solace, save the distant hope that some part of his son's spirit might endure in memory or legend. Priam's counselors and guards tried to offer comfort, but the pain of losing a son, particularly one as central to the city's defense as Hector, could not be mitigated by counsel or ritual. It was a grief of the purest form, raw and unrelenting, a reflection of the human cost of heroism and the inexorable weight of fate. Meanwhile, Achilles, despite his triumph, felt a compulsion to assert dominance over the fallen warrior. He bound Hector's body to his chariot, ensuring that the Greek army would witness the consequences of crossing him and the price paid for the death of Patroclus. The sight of Hector dragged across the plains was a brutal display of vengeance, a public testament to the power of Achilles and the merciless reality of war. Troy's defenders watched in horror, their despair deepening as the city's champion, once a figure of hope and resilience, was reduced to a symbol of mortal vulnerability. The psychological impact was immediate. Courage faltered, morale waned, and the harsh truth of their vulnerability struck like a physical blow to the city's collective heart. Yet even in this moment of humiliation, Hector's legacy could not be erased. Tales of his bravery, his steadfastness, and his dedication to Troy began to circulate among soldiers and citizens alike, whispered amidst tears and shared in quiet reverence. He was remembered not merely as a warrior, but as the embodiment of duty and honor, a man whose life had been devoted to protecting those who could not protect themselves. The lessons of his courage would endure beyond the battlefield, shaping the hearts and minds of those who survived, providing inspiration even amidst the overwhelming despair of loss. Within the palace walls, Andromache received the news with a grief so profound that it threatened to consume her entirely. Her cries filled the halls, echoing off stone and wood, a raw testament to the depth of her love and the cruel hand of fate that had separated her from her husband in such a final and irreversible way. Astyanax, too young to fully comprehend the permanence of death, clung to his mother, sensing the sorrow but not its source. Andromache's mourning was both personal and symbolic, a representation of the suffering endured by all who loved Hector, all who relied upon him, and all who faced the devastating consequences of war. Her grief was a mirror to the city's own, a reflection of the collective anguish that enveloped Troy in the wake of its greatest loss. As night fell over the plains, the city's defenders struggled to maintain coherence. Orders were shouted, commands attempted to hold the lines, but the absence of Hector was a void too great to fill. Soldiers who had followed him without question now faltered, hesitation creeping into movements that had once been swift and decisive. The Greeks pressed forward, sensing the shift in morale, their assault relentless and methodical. Troy's fate, once balanced on the edge of valor and desperation, now leaned toward calamity, accelerated by the loss of the figure who had held it together for so long. Priam, determined to retrieve his son's body, summoned his courage and devised a plan to approach Achilles directly. Guided by grief and paternal devotion, the old king prepared to face the very man who had slain his son, understanding the danger yet compelled by love and honor. Clad in modest garments, accompanied by few guards and offering gifts to appeal to the hero's sense of respect, Priam moved toward the Greek encampment under the cover of night. His journey was perilous, every step a test of resolve, yet his determination to honor Hector, to ensure he received the rites of burial, outweighed fear or personal safety. The courage of a father, unbound by age or fatigue, drove him forward into the heart of enemy territory. When Priam confronted Achilles, the meeting was a remarkable convergence of human emotion and heroic consequence. The aged king fell to his knees before the Greek, beseeching him for mercy, appealing to his sense of honor, and invoking the bonds of shared humanity even in the midst of relentless war. Achilles, moved in some measure by Priam's grief and the nobility of his appeal, relented. He allowed the body of Hector to be returned to Troy, granting the city a measure of dignity in the midst of its suffering. This act, however, did not erase the loss or lessen the impact of Hector's death. It merely provided a brief respite from the brutality of war, a recognition that even in conflict, some measure of respect and ritual could endure. The return of Hector's body was a somber procession, the people of Troy lining the streets to witness their fallen champion brought home. Tears were shed openly, prayers whispered to the gods, and lamentations filled the air. Priam led the way, carrying the weight of grief that seemed to settle over the city like a tangible shroud. Andromache and Astyanax, together with the elders and priests, received Hector's body with reverence, performing the rites that honored his life and courage. The mourning was profound and unbroken, a collective acknowledgement of the sacrifice made, the lives lost, and the fragile nature of human endeavor in the face of overwhelming fate. Even as the people grieved, the shadow of war lingered. Troy's walls, once fortified by the courage of its defenders, now faced the relentless pressure of the Greek army with a diminished hope. The absence of Hector, the psychological and strategic blow of his death, and the undeniable momentum of Achilles' vengeance created an atmosphere of looming despair. Yet, in the midst of sorrow, Hector's legacy endured. Tales of his valor would be recounted for generations, the embodiment of courage, duty, and honor serving as a reminder that even in defeat, nobility of spirit could transcend mortal limitations. Thus ended the life of Hector, Troy's greatest champion, fallen on the plains of battle, yet immortalized in memory and legend. His death marked a turning point, both a personal tragedy and a pivotal moment in the fate of a city under siege. The grief of Priam, the mourning of Andromache, the despair of Troy's defenders, and even the complex emotions stirred within Achilles testified to the extraordinary nature of this man. Hector had lived and fought with unwavering resolve, meeting his destiny with courage, dignity, and the steadfast love of home, family, and city. In the annals of Troy and the tales of the Greeks, his story would endure, a testament to the enduring power of heroism even in the shadow of death. The morning sun rose over Troy with a muted brilliance, its golden rays struggling to pierce the heavy pall of grief that hung over the city. The streets, once filled with the clamor of soldiers and the hum of daily life, were now eerily still. The fall of Hector, Troy's greatest protector, had left a void too deep for words. Mothers held their children close, whispering prayers to gods who seemed absent, while warriors shuffled through the streets, their faces pale and eyes hollow with sorrow. Even the walls of Troy, steadfast for generations, seemed to groan under the weight of the city's despair. Priam, the aged king, wandered the palace halls in quiet mourning. Each room seemed to echo with memories of sons lost, of hope deferred and courage extinguished. The death of Hector had shattered not only his heart but the morale of the city itself. Yet Priam understood that grief, while overwhelming, could not paralyze action. The war still raged beyond the gates, and the Greeks, led by the relentless force of Achilles, were emboldened by the knowledge that Troy's mightiest warrior no longer stood in their path. The king's thoughts turned to the gods, whose will seemed inscrutable, and he offered silent prayers for guidance and mercy, though the answers remained shrouded in uncertainty. Andromache moved through the city with a heavy heart, clutching her young son Astyanax. The boy's small hands were clumsy around her fingers, his eyes wide with confusion at the sorrow that surrounded him. She tried to shield him from the harsh truths of war, yet she could not hide the magnitude of their loss. Hector's absence was felt in every corner of Troy, in the empty barracks, in the silent courtyards, and in the faces of those who had looked to him for leadership. Andromache's grief was both personal and universal, a reflection of the collective mourning that had settled over the city like a shadow that refused to lift. Outside the walls, the Greek army held its own quiet tension. Even among the victors, the death of Hector had left a mark. Achilles, though satisfied by the revenge he had wrought, understood the significance of the Trojan warrior's life and courage. Hector had been a champion not only of skill but of honor, a man who had carried the burdens of his city with dignity and resilience. The Achaeans, while emboldened by their advantage, could sense the weight of destiny pressing against them. They knew that Troy, even weakened and grieving, was a city that had endured for generations and would not surrender its legacy without leaving a mark on history. The day unfolded in somber rhythm. Messengers moved between the walls and the Greek camp, bringing news, negotiating temporary truces for the burial of the dead, and observing the fragile ceasefire that had been established in the wake of Hector's fall. The battlefield, once a place of chaos and clamor, now lay quiet, scarred by the traces of combat and the blood of those who had given their lives. Priam had secured the body of his son, and the rites of burial began in solemn procession. Citizens lined the streets to honor Hector, and priests chanted prayers that mingled with the soft morning breeze. Each movement, each gesture, was a reminder that life persisted even in the face of overwhelming loss. Yet beneath this pause, the shadow of inevitability loomed. Troy's walls, though formidable, could not hold forever against the relentless might of the Greek army. Supplies were dwindling, morale was fragile, and the memory of Hector, while inspiring, could not alone stave off the tide of conquest. The city faced a quiet reckoning, the slow realization that the end drawn by gods and fate was approaching with inexorable force. Soldiers and civilians alike moved with a cautious vigilance, aware that the temporary lull in combat was not mercy, but a fleeting respite before the storm returned with renewed intensity. The gods themselves seemed to watch the city with a mixture of interest and detachment. Athena, protector of the Greeks, observed from her vantage, while Apollo, who had favored Hector in life, lingered in silent sorrow. Their divine interventions had shaped the war from its earliest days, and yet the final outcome appeared already inscribed by forces beyond mortal understanding. Troy's fate, once a contest of courage and strategy, was now entwined with the decrees of heaven, and the city's inhabitants could do little but endure the shadow of destiny as it crept inexorably closer. Within the city, Priam convened with the remaining leaders, his voice steady despite the grief in his heart. "We must honor our dead and prepare for what comes," he said, his eyes sweeping over the commanders and elders who still bore the responsibility of defense. "Hector gave us his courage. Now it is our duty to carry it forward, to protect those who remain, and to face the days ahead with resolve, however grim they may be." His words were met with nods of agreement, tempered by silent fear. Each man knew that the loss of Hector was more than the death of a warrior, it was a turning point that would shape the final days of Troy. As the sun climbed higher, the city attempted to maintain routine, a fragile illusion of normalcy amidst mourning. Markets operated on limited scale, blacksmiths repaired weapons, and scouts moved cautiously along the perimeter, assessing the enemy's positions. Yet everywhere, grief shadowed activity. The absence of Troy's champion was a constant presence, a reminder of vulnerability, and of the unrelenting pressure that pressed upon the city from all sides. Mothers whispered tales of Hector's bravery to their children, soldiers recalled his guidance in battle, and even the streets seemed to remember the cadence of a life that had inspired courage and unity. In the Greek camp, Achilles remained vigilant, knowing that even a grieving city could muster defenses. His mind, though partially satisfied by vengeance, was alert to the strategic realities of war. He understood that Troy's fall was not yet complete, that the city's defenders, though shaken, still held knowledge of terrain, skill in combat, and a desire to survive. The son of Peleus, consumed by a complex mixture of triumph and grief, waited patiently, understanding that the next strike, when it came, would be decisive. As night approached, the city of Troy seemed to hold its breath. Fires flickered in the courtyards, casting long shadows across the walls. The sound of the evening wind was muted, carrying with it the scent of blood, dust, and incense offered to the gods. Families huddled together, seeking comfort in one another, while soldiers took stock of their positions, aware that the final chapter of Troy's resistance was approaching. The city, though sorrowful and weakened, retained a fragile dignity, a testament to the endurance of human spirit even in the shadow of inevitable destruction. Priam, sitting alone in the palace garden, gazed out toward the plains where Achilles had exacted vengeance. His hands rested upon the earth, grounding him, even as his mind traced the memory of Hector's life and sacrifice. He whispered prayers to Zeus, to Apollo, and to the gods of Troy, asking only that the final days be met with honor and that his people, his family, and his city be granted the courage to face what must come. The king understood that grief alone could not protect them, and yet he drew strength from the memory of his son, from the courage Hector had embodied, and from the hope that this final dawn, however dark, could inspire the endurance needed for the trials ahead. The shadow over Troy was not merely of grief, but of destiny itself. The gods had long decreed the city's fall, and mortals could only respond as best they might. Soldiers prepared their defenses, women and children found shelter, and the streets whispered with anticipation and fear. Every heart beat in anxious rhythm, every eye watched the horizon, and every mind considered the cost of the days to come. Troy, once proud and resilient, now faced the narrowing path between survival and annihilation, the city's legacy hanging in balance as the war paused in sorrow but moved inexorably toward its final act. Thus, the last dawn rose over Troy, a city caught between mourning and the certainty of fate. The memory of Hector lingered in every glance, every whispered prayer, and every cautious step across the streets. The shadow of gods and destiny stretched across the walls and plains, a reminder that even the greatest courage could not alter the course of predetermined history. Troy endured this day in solemn reflection, hearts heavy but unbroken, preparing as best they could for the approaching storm that would decide the city's ultimate fate.